Imagine waking up one morning in Rome. The city is still the center of the most powerful world power of its time. Its streets are full of merchants, senators, soldiers, and rumors. But something crucial has changed. The emperor is dead, the old order is falling apart, and no one knows who will rule over the Roman Empire in the end. Within a few months, 4 men grab power: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. Each of them believes that he is the rightful ruler. Everyone is supported by other groups. And each shows in his own way how dangerous it became when Rome no longer had an undisputed emperor. The year 69 AD went down in history as the Roman year of the 4 emperors. It was a year full of betrayal, violence, political intrigue, and bloody decisions. For the first time, it became openly apparent that the emperor was no longer determined solely by origin, senate, or capital. The legions in the provinces, far away from Rome, could suddenly decide who ruled over the empire. Soldiers became kingmakers. Loyalty turned into power. And a change of throne turned into a civil war. Before we dive deeper into this dramatic story, write me in the comments, who do you think had the real power in the Roman Empire? The emperor in Rome, the Senate, or the legions on the borders? I am curious to hear your opinion, because this is exactly the question at the center of the 4 emperors year. If you are interested in historical power struggles, Roman history, and the great turning points of antiquity, then feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss any more exciting chapters from the history of Rome. And now we travel back to a year in which the greatest empire of antiquity was on the verge of breaking up due to its own power struggle. 1. Rome after Nero, an empire without a secure center. When Nero died in June 68 AD, not only the life of an emperor ended, but also an entire epoch of Roman rule. With him, the last representative of the Julian Claudian dynasty, the ruling family that had formed the political center of the empire since Augustus, disappeared. For almost a century, Rome had learned to regard the emperor as a permanent fixture. Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero had differed greatly in character, style, and political talent, but they all stood in a line that could be traced back to Caesar and Augustus. This origin was more than just a name. It was a symbol of order, continuity, and legitimacy. When Nero died, it suddenly became apparent how dependent the entire political system had become on this dynastic idea. Nero's rule had severely shaken the confidence of many groups in the empire. In the early years, he had ruled under the influence of experienced advisors such as Seneca and Burrus, but over time his government was increasingly characterized by mistrust, waste, repression, and personal self-dramatization. For many senators, Nero had become a ruler who threatened their dignity, could confiscate their fortunes, and made their lives dependent on whims. Although he remained popular with parts of the people in Rome, especially because of his games, gifts, and public appearances, the political elites increasingly found his rule unbearable. In addition, there were military and financial burdens, discontent in the provinces, and the impression that the emperor was more interested in the stage, art, and personal fame than in the sober administration of a huge empire. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD had further damaged Nero's reputation. Whether Nero himself was responsible for the fire is historically disputed, but the decisive factor was that many Romans believed that he could do it. The subsequent construction projects, especially his enormous palace complex, the Domus Aurea, seemed to opponents like a sign of excessive self-importance. While parts of the population suffered from the consequences of the fire, the emperor seemed to want to immortalize his own greatness in stone and gold. His persecution of opponents, the executions of prominent personalities, and the constant fear of denunciation also destroyed the trust of the senatorial upper class. An emperor who no longer appeared as a guarantor of order, but as a danger to property, rank, and life, could hardly hope for stable loyalty in the long run. Nevertheless, Nero's fall was not an orderly transition. The Roman Empire did not have a clear constitution in the event that an emperor died without heirs or collapsed politically. Formally, the Senate, the magistrates, and old republican offices continued to exist, but the real power had long been in the hands of the princeps, i.e. the emperor, and the military forces that supported his rule. Augustus had deliberately created this system without openly calling it a monarchy. Rome was to continue to look as if the Republic continued to exist, while in fact a single man had the decisive authority. As long as there was a recognized ruling family, this system could work. But when the dynasty ended, a dangerous question arose. Who was allowed to become emperor? This is exactly where the deep crisis began. The Senate could theoretically recognize a new ruler, but it did not have the military power to enforce its decision everywhere. The Praetorian Guard in Rome could protect or overthrow an emperor, but their power alone was not sufficient to permanently control the entire empire. The legions on the borders, on the other hand, had experienced soldiers, weapons, and commanders, but were far away from the capital. They had their own interests, their own loyalties, and their own expectations. In Germania, Spain, Syria, Judea, Britain, Africa, and on the Danube there were troops who protected the empire, but now also realized that their consent could decide on the highest power. That was the real revolutionary thing about the year of the four emperors. It showed that the emperor was no longer made only in Rome. The capital remained symbolically important, but the empire had long since become too large for the political order to be decided solely in the Senate House or in the palace. The provinces were no longer mere peripheral areas. There were the legions, there were taxes collected, there were strategic key rooms, there were the men, without whom no emperor could exist. Whoever controlled the armies had a power that was superior to any speech in the Senate. Nero's end began in the provinces. Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, rose up against him and called for resistance. Vindex itself did not have the strongest military base, but its uprising was a signal. He showed that open rebellion against Nero had become possible. At the same time, Servius Sulpicius Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, emerged as a possible new ruler. Galba was old, respected, of senatorial origin, and was considered by many to be the antithesis of Nero. He embodied austerity, tradition, and Roman dignity. For Nero's opponents, he was therefore an obvious hope. But his elevation was also a dangerous precedent. An emperor could now come from a province, supported by troops and political support outside Rome. When Nero realized that support was slipping away from him, his rule quickly collapsed. The Praetorian Guard turned away from him, the Senate declared him an enemy of the state, and the once most powerful man in the world suddenly found himself isolated. His suicide was the dramatic end of a government that had outlived itself. But there was no peace with his death. Many had wanted to eliminate Nero, but hardly anyone had a clear idea of how the empire was to be stabilized afterwards. The old dynasty had disappeared, and with it the story that had given the emperors a special position since Augustus. Rome was now in a state of tense uncertainty. There may have been people on the streets of the capital who welcomed Nero's death, but behind the relief there was fear. Everyone knew that a change of rule was dangerous. The Praetorians awaited rewards. The Senate hoped for greater influence. The population wanted supplies, games, and peace. The armies in the provinces watched closely to see if the new emperor would respect and pay for their services. A single mistake could destroy loyalty. A thoughtless word, a refusal to pay money, or a preference for certain troops could turn discontent into rebellion. Galba, who now came to Rome as the new emperor, did not inherit a secure empire, but a dangerous power vacuum. He had to prove that he could not only be Nero's opponent, but a real ruler. He had to calm the Senate, win over the Praetorians, involve the provinces, put the finances in order, and give the impression that Rome had a firm center again. But it was precisely this center that no longer existed as a matter of course. The imperial office had been disenchanted by Nero's fall. If one emperor could fall, then another could also be overthrown. If one army could proclaim a ruler, then other armies could do the same. The empire had discovered a truth that would never be completely forgotten in the future. Power was not based solely on name, tradition, or recognition, but on armed loyalty. The year 69 AD was therefore more than a short succession of 4 emperors. It was a shocking moment in Roman history. It revealed the weaknesses of a system that appeared powerful and orderly on the outside, but did not have a certain rule for succession on the inside. The crisis did not begin with the battles between Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. It began at the moment when Nero died and no one could convincingly answer who had the right to rule Rome. This open question gave rise to a civil war that shook the empire and showed the Romans that their world power, while huge, was not invulnerable. 2. The fall of the last Julio Claudier. The fall of Nero was not a single moment, but the result of a long inner disintegration. When the emperor came under increasing pressure in 68 AD, his rule was still surrounded by splendor on the outside. Rome had palaces, temples, theaters, a huge administration, and the greatest military power in the known world. But behind this facade, trust in the emperor had already become fragile. Nero had not only made enemies, but had also antagonized entire groups that were crucial to the functioning of the empire. Senators feared his arbitrariness, wealthy families his confiscations, military leaders his unpredictability, and provinces his financial demands. A ruler could survive many opponents as long as he held the decisive pillars of his power firmly in his hand. But Nero gradually lost exactly these supports. In the first years of his reign, Nero had still been considered a hope. He was young, popular, and advised by experienced men. Seneca, the philosopher, and Burrus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, stood for a moderate government that respected the Senate and maintained public peace. But over time, Nero moved away from this political restraint. His mother Agrippina, who had once opened the way to power for him, became a rival and was eventually eliminated. Her murder in 59 was more than a family crime. He showed that Nero was willing to cut even the closest ties if they stood in the way of his autocracy. Later, further acts of violence, political trials, and executions followed. The impression grew that the lives of leading Romans were no longer protected by law or rank, but depended solely on the will of the emperor. This development was dangerous for the senatorial upper class. Since Augustus, the senators have lived with a contradiction. They still had titles, dignity, and public importance, but the real power lay with the emperor. This balance could work as long as the princeps respected their honor and at least made them feel involved in the state. Nero, however, broke through this delicate game. His artistic performances, his appearance as a singer, charioteer, and stage man, his lavish projects, and his disregard for old aristocratic ideas seemed to many senators like a humiliation of the imperial office. For the people, games, plays, and gifts might be appealing, but for the elite there was the disturbing question of whether Rome was still ruled by a responsible ruler or by a man who put his own self-portrayal above the state. The financial situation weighed particularly heavily. Nero's expenses were enormous. The reconstruction of Rome after the Great Fire of 64, the construction of the Domus Aurea, the costly games, gifts, building programs, and courtly waste put a strain on the state finances. In order to raise money, the government repeatedly resorted to lawsuits, asset confiscation, and heavier burdens. For many rich Romans, political suspicion could mean the loss of property. As a result, opposition became not only a question of honor, but also of survival. Anyone who was too powerful, too rich, or too respected could quickly be declared a threat. Such a climate did not generate real loyalty, but fear. And fear is only useful for a ruler as long as it does not turn into despair. Dissatisfaction also grew in the provinces. The Roman Empire was dependent on sensitive interaction. The provinces provided taxes, grain, soldiers, and political stability. In return, they expected protection, order, and a predictable administration. However, if the impression arose that Rome was using its resources primarily to finance imperial waste, loyalty could wane. Especially in Gaul, a climate arose in which resistance became possible. Their Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, rose up against Nero. Vindex was himself a Roman senator and not a simple rebel from the peripheries. His uprising was therefore politically dangerous. It did not come from outside, but from within the Roman order. Vindex did not simply present himself as the new emperor. His significance lay above all in the fact that he dared to openly resist Nero and called on other influential men to join him. This made it clear that Nero's opponents were no longer just whispering secretly, but were ready to act publicly. Vindex turned to Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis. Galba was a man of old age, noble birth, and long political experience. He seemed like the opposite of Nero. Where Nero appeared young, theatrical, and lavish, Galba stood for austerity, tradition, and aristocratic dignity. It was precisely for this reason that he became a hope for many of Nero's opponents. His mere availability showed that there were alternatives to the last Julio Claudier. For Nero, this development was extremely dangerous. As long as discontent remained in Rome, he could control it through the Praetorian Guard, trials, or intimidation. But when provincial governors and legions came into play, the situation changed fundamentally. An emperor who was no longer supported by the armies had only the appearance of power. The legions were far from Rome, but they were the very basis of imperial rule. They guarded the borders, suppressed uprisings, secured tax revenues, and made the emperor's authority visible in the provinces in the first place. If a governor came up against Nero with military support, a conflagration could ensue. Vindex was defeated militarily. The Rhine legions under Lucius Virginius Rufus crushed his uprising, and Vindex took his own life. But his uprising had an effect that went beyond his defeat. He had broken the taboo. For the first time, it had become clear that a Roman emperor was not unassailable. In addition, the attitude of the Rhine legions showed how complicated the situation had become. They defeated Vindex, but their loyalty to Nero was by no means self-evident. Some soldiers might even have wanted to elevate Virginius Rufus himself to emperor. He refused, but only the possibility was significant. When armies began to think of their own candidates, the dynastic order was already shaken. Galba, on the other hand, after initial hesitation, openly opposed Nero. He did not immediately accept the title of emperor, but first presented himself as a representative of the Senate and the Roman people. This caution was politically wise, for it was not intended to make him appear as a mere usurper. But in practice, his step meant an open challenge to the emperor. Now there was a recognized high-ranking man with troops and political weight in the west of the empire who no longer obeyed Nero. For many discontented people, Galba became a gathering point. The decisive factor was not that he already had all the power, but that he offered a credible alternative. In Rome, Nero's power began to disintegrate rapidly in these weeks. The emperor vacillated between anger, fear, escape plans, and theatrical gestures. His opponents became more courageous, his supporters more cautious. The attitude of the Praetorian Guard was particularly important. This elite unit was stationed in Rome and had played a central role in protecting the ruler since the early imperial period. Without them, an emperor in the capital was practically defenseless. When their prefect Nymphidius Sabinus influenced the guard against Nero and promised them large monetary payments in the name of Galba, Nero lost the most important immediate support of his power. The Praetorians were not just soldiers. They were the armed force in the center of the capital. Their apostasy was a death sentence for the emperor's rule. The Senate reacted to the changed situation and declared Nero an enemy of the state. This step was symbolically enormous. The man who shortly before had to be revered as princeps, the supreme man of the state, was now officially ostracized. Nero fled the palace and sought refuge outside the city. The scenes of his end almost seem like a bitter reversal of his entire rule. The emperor, who had staged himself as an artist, ruler, and center of the world, suddenly found himself abandoned, frightened, and without real power. On June 9, 1968, he took his own life. His famous exclamation about what an artist would perish with him may have been reshaped in literature, but it fits the picture that tradition painted of him, a man who considered his own role even in his downfall. Nero was the last emperor of the Julian Claudian family. This was a turning point for Rome that can hardly be overestimated. Since Augustus, this dynasty, despite all the crises, murders, and scandals, had formed the framework of rule. Even an unpopular emperor could invoke the idea of being part of a special line. After Nero, this legitimacy no longer existed. The throne was suddenly open. The empire had to find a new center, but there was no generally accepted rule as to how this center should be determined. The fall of Nero was therefore initially experienced by many as a liberation, but it was also the beginning of an even greater uncertainty. Those who hated Nero could rejoice. Anyone who needed order had to be afraid. Galba was on his way to Rome, but his power was based on expectations, promises, and recognition, not on an unshakable foundation. The Praetorians awaited their reward. The Senate expected respect. The provinces expect stability. The legions expected their importance to be recognized. Each of these expectations could be disappointed. Nero's end showed how vulnerable the Roman Empire had become as soon as its religious, dynastic, and military legitimacy fell apart. The emperor was not simply a king in the open sense, but a complicated figure of tradition, power, military supreme command, public veneration, and political staging. Nero had damaged many of these elements. His death eliminated the man, but not the crisis that had become visible beneath him. On the contrary, it was only now that the full danger became apparent. If an emperor could fall by insurrection, betrayal of the guard and Senate decision, then any future emperor could also fall. Thus, the overthrow of a single ruler began a systemic crisis. The Roman Empire was not facing the end, but a brutal clarification of its balance of power. The name Caesar alone was no longer enough. Old ancestry was no longer sufficient. The approval of the Senate was no longer sufficient. Those who wanted to rule needed soldiers, money, political alliances, and the ability to hold different interests together. Nero had lost this balance. His successors now had to prove whether they could restore them. But before a new order could emerge, Rome was to go through a year in which the imperial throne became the price of bloody rivalry. 3. Galba, the old senator on the throne. When Servius Sulpicius Galba was recognized as the new ruler after Nero's death, a return to order, dignity, and old discipline seemed possible for many Romans. Galba was not a young adventurer, not an artist emperor, not a man who wanted to make himself popular through games and waste. He came from a highly respected senatorial family, had a long political career behind him, and was exactly the antithesis of Nero in the eyes of many members of the upper class. Where Nero had been considered excessive, theatrical, and dangerous, Galba appeared strict, serious, and conscious of tradition. This is precisely why great hopes were associated with his name. After years of uncertainty, a man was now to govern who was reminiscent of ancient Roman virtues: thrift, a sense of duty, toughness against corruption, and respect for the Senate. But Galba's strength was also his greatest weakness. He was old, physically no longer strong, politically immobile, and often incapable of correctly assessing the new reality of the Reich. He saw himself as the restorer of a moral order, but the empire he had to take over was no longer a manageable republican city-state. It was a huge power structure whose stability depended on salaries, military loyalty, provincial interests, and public perception. Galba believed that he could rule by severity and dignity. But after Nero's fall, the decisive power groups expected not only moral renewal, but concrete rewards, security, and recognition. Galba underestimated these expectations in a disastrous way. His rise had begun in Spain. As governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, Galba was far from Rome, but not insignificant. He had military authority, senatorial prestige, and the reputation of a man who was not characterized by debauchery but by discipline. When Gaius Julius Vindex rose up against Nero in Gaul and encouraged Galba to take the lead against the emperor hesitated at first. This hesitation was understandable, because an open uprising against a reigning emperor was life-threatening. Those who failed not only lost their office, but usually also their lives, their assets, and the security of their family. But Galba realized that Nero's power had become fragile. When he finally broke away from Nero, he did not immediately openly present himself as emperor, but as a representative of the Senate and the Roman people. In doing so, He wanted to show that his actions were not motivated by personal ambition, but by a duty to the state. This portrayal was politically clever, but it could not hide the deeper truth. Galba's power was based on military uprising and on the collapse of the previous order. The Senate was able to recognize him, but the decision had already been prepared by events outside Rome. This alone was a new danger. Galba had not emerged from a recognized dynastic succession, but from an uprising against a hated ruler. So he first had to establish his legitimacy. To do this, he would have had to quickly bind the most important groups to himself: the Senate, the Praetorians, the urban population, and above all, the legions. It was precisely at this task that he failed. When Galba made his way to Rome, it became clear that his reign would not be one of leniency. He had opponents punished, cracked down on actual or alleged followers of Nero, and showed little sense of the psychological situation after a coup. Many people had not acted out of love for Galba, but because they wanted to get rid of Nero. There was a big difference between the rejection of the old emperor and genuine enthusiasm for the new one. Galba, however, seemed to believe that his recognition was self-evident because he was morally above Nero. This miscalculation accompanied his short reign from the beginning. His attitude towards the soldiers became particularly dangerous. The Praetorian Guard had dropped Nero because they had been promised a large payment in the name of Galba. Such payments were more than mere bribery in the Roman Empire. They were a political ritual, a sign of recognition, and a confirmation of the special relationship between emperor and soldiers. Galba, however, refused to keep this promise. He is credited with the sentence that he usually selects soldiers, not buys them. From the point of view of a strict aristocrat, this might sound honorable. From the point of view of the Praetorians, it was a humiliation. They had borne their risk, left their emperor, and supported a new ruler. Now, instead of a reward, they received moral instruction. This decision was devastating. Galba wanted to put the state budget in order and put an end to Nero's wastefulness. This made sense in principle, because the finances of the empire were strained. But political austerity can become dangerous if it destroys one's own power base. The Praetorians stood in Rome, close to the emperor, armed and organized. They were not just any group in the empire, but the military force that could protect or open the palace. Anyone who publicly disappointed them was playing with their lives. Galba realized this too late or not at all. His moral severity did not seem to the soldiers like virtue, but like stinginess and ingratitude. Discontent also grew among the legions in the provinces. The troops on the Rhine in particular felt ignored. They had defeated Vindex and thus indirectly prevented a Gallic uprising from shaking the empire. Nevertheless, they did not receive any special recognition. For soldiers serving on a dangerous border, honor was of great importance. They wanted to know that their performance was seen. Galba, however, did not treat them as a decisive pillar of the new order. Thus, in the camps of Germania, the impression arose that the new emperor favored Rome and certain circles, while the battle-hardened legions at the borders were disregarded. This impression was soon to have political consequences. In Rome itself, Galba's government also became unpopular. The population had suffered much under Nero, but many ordinary people also remembered his games, gifts, and public generosity. Galba, on the other hand, brought no joy, no glamour, and no visible hope. He embodied coldness, saving, and punishment. His measures against Nero's minions and alleged grievances could appear as moral cleansing, but they often seemed harsh and clumsy. People who sought security after a change of power found new insecurity instead. Those who had won under Nero feared revenge. Those who had hoped for Galba were disappointed. Those who had remained neutral saw above all an old ruler who lacked the ability to generate affection. In addition, Galba was dependent on consultants. Since he himself was old and could no longer rule with the energy of a young ruler, men around him gained great influence. Titus Vinius, Cornelius Laco, and Icelus in particular were perceived by many as a kind of sinister group that controlled access to the emperor and influenced decisions. Whether these men were actually as pernicious as later accounts suggest is difficult to judge. Crucially, however, her reputation damaged Galba's reputation. An emperor who wanted to be seen as strict and just was not allowed to give the impression that he was being guided by selfish confidants. However, it was precisely this impression that spread. The decisive question of his reign soon became succession. Galba had no biological heirs, and because of his age it was clear that his government could not have a long future. A stable succession plan might have been able to create trust. Many expected Marcus Salvius Otho to play a central role. Otho had supported Galba early on, was ambitious, and apparently hoped to be chosen as his successor. But Galba decided otherwise. He adopted Lucius Calpurnius Piso Licinianus, a young man from a noble family who stood for aristocratic virtue and traditional legitimacy. From Galba's point of view, this choice was consistent. Piso was to show that the state should not be led by bribery and the will of soldiers, but by dignity, origin, and character. Politically, however, this decision was highly risky. Otho felt ignored and betrayed. The Praetorians were still dissatisfied because they had not received their promised payment. Many soldiers did not see Piso as a man who understood their interests. Galba had thus appointed a successor who strengthened his own political message, but did not create new loyalty. He did not solve the crisis, but exacerbated it. At a moment when the emperor should have included the disappointed power groups, he opted for a sign of aristocratic principles. This may have seemed morally clean, but it was dangerous in terms of power politics. Galba's brief reign shows the deep tension between Roman tradition and imperial reality. He may have wanted to be a better ruler than Nero, but he didn't understand that after Nero's fall, an emperor needed more than decency and old names. He had to serve expectations, cultivate alliances, reward soldiers, reassure the capital, and make the provinces feel part of a stable order. Galba saw the state primarily through the eyes of an old senator. But the empire has long been held together by armies, money flows, and complex loyalties. Galba thus went from being a beacon of hope to a symbol of political failure. He had survived Nero, but not the powers that Nero's fall had unleashed. His attempt to purify the empire through austerity met with a reality in which power did not arise solely from moral demands. The Praetorians felt betrayed, Otho sought revenge, the Rhine legions looked for a candidate of their own, and Rome sensed that the new emperor had not created a firm center. Galba sat on the throne, but the throne did not rest securely under him. His rule was a transitional government from the beginning, even if he himself did not want to admit it. The year of the four emperors had only just begun, and it was already clear that the fall of Nero had not brought peace, but had opened the struggle over the question of who could still claim legitimate power in Rome. 4. Disappointed legions and broken promises. Galba's rule failed not only because of his age, his austerity, or his lack of popularity in Rome. It failed above all because of a problem that lay deep in the political system of the empire. A Roman emperor could not rely solely on dignity, origin, and Senate decisions. He needed the approval of the soldiers. Not only the approval of the Praetorian Guard in the capital, but also the loyalty of the legions in the provinces. These men stood on the borders of the empire, often far away from the splendor of Rome, in camps on the Rhine, on the Danube, in Syria, Judea, Britain, or North Africa. They protected the empire, they fought against external enemies, they secured Roman power with blood, discipline, and daily hardship. If they got the impression that an emperor was disregarding them, his rule could seem so noble. She was inwardly threatened. After Nero's death, the mood in the armies was tense. Many soldiers had experienced the events not as an orderly transfer of power, but as proof that an emperor could be overthrown if enough influential groups let him fall. Nero had not died in a peaceful succession. He had been abandoned by the Guard, by the Senate, by political allies, and finally by almost everyone who had previously benefited from his power. This experience changed the perception of the empire. If Nero could fall, then Galba was not untouchable either. If a governor from Spain could rise to the rank of emperor, why should not another candidate be raised by other legions? Nero's death opened a door that could not simply be closed again. Galba underestimated this new situation. He considered himself a man of order and apparently believed that the soldiers had to submit to his authority because his rule was recognized by the Senate and justified by the downfall of Nero. But the legions did not think only in legal or moral categories. For them, honor, reward, recognition, and trust counted. They wanted to know if the new emperor saw their victims. They wanted to feel that their loyalty was worth something. In a military world in which pay, booty, donatives, and awards had political significance, a refused wage could be understood as an insult. This is exactly what happened under Galba. The broken promise to the Praetorian Guard weighed particularly heavily. When Nero fell, the Praetorians had played a decisive role. They were the armed force in Rome, and their defection from the emperor made Nero's position hopeless. They had been promised a large payment in the name of Galba. Such payments were not just bribery in the simple sense. They had long been part of the political culture of the empire. When soldiers took office, they expected a kind of recognition gift. It was a visible sign that the new ruler understood the special relationship between the emperor and the army. Galba, however, refused to make this payment. His famous statement that he used to select soldiers and not buy them may have been an expression of old Roman severity from his point of view. To the Praetorians, it sounded like mockery. This refusal was more than a financial decision. It touched the honor of the guard. The Praetorians had taken a risk. They had left their previous emperor and thus crossed a political border. Anyone who dropped an emperor had to be sure that the new ruler would reward and protect this decision. Instead, Galba treated them as if they had only done their duty. He demanded loyalty without fulfilling the promise that had bought or at least sealed their loyalty. In doing so, he did not create discipline, but bitterness. The men who were supposed to protect the imperial palace in Rome began to distance themselves from him. The legions on the Rhine also felt offended. Their situation was particularly explosive. The Germanic armies had a proud military tradition. They stood on one of the most dangerous borders of the empire and saw themselves as a battle-hardened elite. While other groups had rebelled against Nero, they had crushed the Vindex's uprising. From their point of view, they had made an important achievement. But after Nero's death, they were not honored accordingly. Galba became emperor, although his power base was originally in Spain, while the Rhine legions felt that their role was being ignored. They had fought, but others benefited politically. This insult was linked to a deeper problem. The legions in the provinces lived in a world of their own. Her bond with Rome was strong, but she was shaped by direct experiences. For many soldiers, the emperor was a distant figure who was present through orders, coins, oaths, images, and promises. Much closer to them were their commanders, their camp communities, and the comrades with whom they served for years. If an army felt that it was being disregarded by Rome, loyalty could quickly shift to its own candidate. This was exactly the danger for Galba. He ruled from Rome, but the military power of the empire was widely distributed in the provinces. In Germania, discontent began to intensify. The soldiers there realized that they were strong enough to carry political weight. They saw that Galba was not protected by an untouchable dynasty. They knew that the Senate alone could not hold an emperor against the will of powerful armies. And they had a man in mind whom they could consider an alternative, Aulus Vitellius, the commander in Lower Germania. Vitellius was not a great general in the classical sense, but he knew how to show closeness to the soldiers. He was less strict than Galba, seemed more approachable, generous, and comradely. This was important for disappointed legionnaires. They were not just looking for a political name, but someone who took their expectations seriously. The elevation of Vitellius therefore did not arise from a single order, but from a mood. The Rhine legions were not prepared to take Galba for granted. They refused to give him the usual loyalty in the expected form and increasingly turned to Vitellius. He was proclaimed emperor by his troops at the beginning of January 69. This revealed what had been in the air since Nero's fall. The emperor could be made by an army. Not only in Rome, not only by the Senate, not only by the Praetorians, but on the frontier, in the camps of the legions. That was a political upheaval of the utmost importance. For Galba, this development was deadly dangerous. He had already disappointed the Praetorians, failed to win over the population, and only partially fulfilled many of the Senate's expectations. Now a military counter-emperor arose in the north. In a stable monarchy, such an uprising might have appeared as a rebellion of individual troops. In the year 69, however, the entire system was so uncertain that any military claim immediately became an imperial crisis. Vitellius had the support of strong fighting units. When they marched into Italy, Galba could hardly oppose them with an unshakable front of loyalty. The empire began to divide into power blocks. Galba's broken promises acted like sparks in dry wood. In Rome, the Praetorians were resentful. In Germania, the legions felt disregarded. Otho, who had hoped for the succession, was humiliated by Piso's adoption. Each of these conflicts could perhaps have been controlled on its own. Together, however, they formed a deadly mixture. Galba had managed to disappoint several crucial groups at the same time. He had not created a new dynasty, had not built up an emotional bond with the people, had not generated a strong military gratitude, and had not involved an ambitious rival. Instead, he believed that the authority of the state was sufficient to enforce obedience. But what was this state after Nero's death? The Senate had importance, but no army of its own. The Praetorians had weapons, but no empire-wide legitimacy. The legions had power, but no common political direction. The provinces were important, but not uniform. The emperor was supposed to hold all these forces together, but Galba had neither the personal charisma nor the tactical flexibility to do so. His severity might have generated respect in quiet times. In a crisis, she seemed cold, hurtful, and blind. The soldiers in particular understood very well that rule was mutual. They swore allegiance to the emperor, but the emperor had to offer them pay, provision, recognition, and a future. This relationship was not idealistic, but practical. A legionnaire did not risk his life for abstract dignity alone. He served an empire that promised him status, pay, companionship, and later perhaps land or provision. If the emperor disregarded these expectations, the oath of allegiance became hollow inside. Galba demanded old discipline without creating new loyalty. Thus, his rule was undermined from within. The disappointment of the soldiers was not a side issue, but the core of the crisis. The year of the four emperors showed its real dynamic here. Not the best orator, not the most distinguished aristocrat, and not the most morally strict man automatically won power, but the one who could organize military loyalty. Galba had replaced Nero, but he hadn't understood that the world was a different one after Nero. The armies had recognized their own importance. The Praetorians had learned that they could overthrow emperors. The provincial legions had learned that they could raise emperors. And ambitious men had learned that a throne without a fixed dynasty was an invitation to action. In the end, Galba's broken promises were like a verdict on his government. He wanted to save the state by cleansing it of waste. But he confused thriftiness with strength and toughness with authority. He overlooked the fact that a ruler must not only be right after a coup, but must bind people to himself. In Rome, armed men were waiting for an opportunity. On the Rhine, the claim of Vitellius marched up. And Otho, aggrieved and determined, realized that Galba's power was far weaker than it appeared on the outside. Disappointment turned into conspiracy. Broken promises turned into civil war. The Reich was now on the threshold of a year in which the loyalty of the soldiers was to count more than any solemn word of the Senate. 5. Otho, ambition, betrayal, and the struggle for recognition. Marcus Salvius Otho was not a man who accidentally got caught up in the maelstrom of the year of the four emperors. He was ambitious, experienced, socially adept, and intimately familiar with Rome's power mechanisms. His person combined personal insult, political calculation, and the dangerous openness of a time when the imperial throne was no longer protected by a fixed dynasty. Otho had known Nero. He had experienced the world of the court. He knew how closeness to the emperor could mean advancement, but also a fall. Precisely for this reason, he understood better than Galba that rule was not secured by dignity and principles alone. It had to be organized, paid, staged, and carried by armed men. When Galba passed him over, Otho realized that his own future could no longer be secured by patience, but only by decisive action. Otho's past was closely linked to the darker sides of the Neronian period. He had once belonged to the circle around Nero and had been married to Poppaea Sabina, the woman who later became Nero's wife. The ancient sources tell this connection with much moral acuity and courtly intrigue. Whether every detail is reliable remains questionable, but what is certain is that Otho learned early on how dangerous proximity to power could be. He was removed from the center and sent to Lusitania as governor. For an ambitious man, this might at first seem like exile at a high level, but Otho used the years in the provinces to gain administrative experience and ensure his political survival. He was not a mere bon vivant, as hostile representations tend to make him appear. He had patience, adaptability, and a sense for the right moment. When Galba rose up against Nero, Otho sided with him early on. This step was not only an expression of political conviction, but also an investment in the future. Otho supported Galba on his way to power and could expect to be rewarded for it. Since Galba was old and had no sons of his own, it was hoped that Otho could one day be groomed as a successor. For Otho, this was more than personal vanity. In the uncertain situation after Nero's death, the question of succession was decisive. Whoever was to become Galba's heir was not only given the prospect of the throne, but immediate political rank. Otho apparently believed that he had earned this position. He had taken sides early on, bore risks, and helped Galba when his success was not yet completely certain. But Galba decided otherwise. On January 10, 69, he adopted Lucius Calpurnius Piso Licinianus, a young man of noble birth, but without a strong military base and without much popularity among the Praetorians. From Galba's point of view, Piso was perhaps the right candidate, aristocratic, dignified, seemingly unspoiled, and fit to embody a moral renewal of the state. For Otho, this election was a personal humiliation and a political death sentence. He had hoped to be recognized as an heir, and now he saw that Galba not only passed him over, but replaced him with another. In the world of Roman power, such a setback did not merely mean disappointed ambition. It could be dangerous, because a bypassed man with connections, debts, ambitions, and followers had little reason to remain silent. Otho was also in financial distress. He had spent a lot of money, cultivated relationships, and raised expectations. A political rise could have saved his situation, but exclusion from the succession made him vulnerable. Those who played high and lost in the Roman power struggle could not simply return to a quiet private life. Otho had to act before Galba consolidated his position, and Piso was universally recognized as an heir. Time worked against him. Every day could make Galba's succession decision stronger. Every day could unsettle Otho's followers. At the same time, the discontent of the Praetorians presented a unique opportunity. The Praetorian Guard was the key. Galba had refused to pay her the promised money, thus creating bitterness. The men who stood armed in the center of Rome felt betrayed. They had dropped Nero and opened the way for Galba, but the new emperor treated them not as decisive supporters, but as soldiers who owed obedience without anything in return. Otho understood this mood. He knew that moral rigor had little effect on hungry, offended, and armed men. He promised what Galba had refused: recognition, money, and closeness. In doing so, he not only bought a conspiracy, but also offered the Praetorians a new political role. They could not only be disappointed, they could act. On January 15, 1969, the decisive blow occurred. Otho left Galba's entourage on a pretext and went to the Praetorians. There he was proclaimed emperor. The speed of events shows how little firm Galba's rule actually was. An emperor who had appeared a few months ago as the savior of the state lost control of the capital within a few hours. The Praetorians fought Otho out as the new ruler, while Galba and Piso had little time to react effectively. Galba was killed on the forum. Piso shortly afterwards as well. The old emperor, who had believed that he did not have to buy soldiers, fell at the hands of the armed force whose expectations he had disregarded. Otho's seizure of power was a betrayal, but it was also a symptom of the crisis. He overthrew Galba not in a stable system, but in an order that was already fragile. His act was shocking because it happened in the middle of Rome, before the eyes of the public that longed for peace. But it was not incomprehensible. Galba had disappointed too many groups, Otho had seen an opportunity, and the Praetorians had used their power. The murder of Galba finally made it clear that the imperial office was no longer protected by reverence. An emperor could die in the forum if the armed men near him turned against him. After his uprising, Otho was faced with a difficult problem. He had won the throne by force, but he had to immediately give the impression that he was not just a usurper and murderer. He needed recognition. The Senate, which had just supported Galba, had to accept him. The population had to be reassured. The Praetorians had to be rewarded, but at the same time controlled. And above all, Otho had to assert himself against Vitellius, whose troops had already proclaimed their own emperor in Germania. Otho therefore had hardly time to consolidate his rule. Even as he was taking power in Rome, a much greater military threat was moving towards Italy from the north. Otho tried to present himself as a legitimate ruler. He assumed imperial titles, sought the approval of the Senate, and endeavored to establish public order. In doing so, he showed more political skill than his opponents later wanted to concede to him. He was not simply an impulsive conspirator. He understood that he had to build trust after the violent start of his government. He had some of the soldiers' expectations fulfilled, initially avoided unnecessary harshness, and tried to show himself as a man of reconciliation. Even the handling of Nero's memory played a role. Parts of the population had not forgotten Nero, and some longed for his glory back. Otho, who had a connection to the Neronian world, was able to take advantage of this mood cautiously, without fully identifying with Nero's failed rule. But his situation remained precarious. His main power base was the Praetorians and the troops available in Italy. Vitellius, on the other hand, was carried by battle-hardened Rhine legions. These men had served on the border for years. They were militarily tough, self-confident, and convinced that their candidate had as rightful a claim as Otho. This pitted two forms of military legitimacy. Otho had been raised by the guard in Rome, Vitellius by the legions on the frontier. Both could claim to be carried by soldiers. Both could refer to Galba's weakness. Both showed that the Senate only confirmed retrospectively what the armed force had already decided. Otho now had to prove in a few weeks that he was more than the winner of a palace overthrow. He had to be a general, politician, and symbolic figure at the same time. His government was determined by the compulsion to speed. He could not negotiate for long, because Vitellius' troops were marching. He could not start reforms in peace, because the civil war was already underway. He could not build his legitimacy slowly, because any delay had to appear as a weakness. This was precisely the tragedy of his short reign. Otho had used the decisive moment to overthrow Galba, but he had no opportunity to turn the seizure of power into a stable order. His ambition was undeniable, but it wasn't just personal greed. Otho lived in a political world where setback could be deadly, and where decisive action often seemed to be the only salvation. He betrayed Galba, but Galba had previously betrayed the expectations of many who had brought him to power. Otho let himself be raised by the Praetorians, but they had already learned that they could make emperors and overthrow them. His act was morally charged, but politically logical at a time when the rules of succession had been broken. In the end, Otho stands at the beginning of his reign as a man between success and the abyss. He had won the throne, but not the security that a throne was supposed to promise. He had eliminated Galba, but had not stopped Vitellius. He had the Praetorians behind him, but not the strongest legions of the empire. His struggle for recognition began the moment he became emperor. And it is precisely this struggle that shows the brutal logic of the year of the four emperors. Power could be seized quickly, but it was incomparably more difficult to maintain it. Otho had proven that Galba could fall. Now he had to prove that he himself would not fall as well. 6. Vitellius, the emperor of the Rhine legions. Aulus Vitellius did not appear in the year of the four emperors as a great political innovator or as a man with a clear vision for the empire. His rise was based less on an outstanding personal program than on the dissatisfaction of those troops who felt ignored by Galba. This is precisely where its historical significance lies. Vitellius became emperor because the legions on the Rhine recognized their own power and because they were no longer willing to simply accept a decision from Rome or Spain. His uprising showed with brutal clarity that the Roman Empire was no longer ruled only in the center. The borders, the camps, the veterans and the commanders could decide the throne. Vitellius was the man in whom this new truth became visible. The Rhine legions were among the strongest military forces in the empire. They stood on a border that had a special significance since the defeat of Varus in the year 9 AD. Germania was not just any peripheral zone for Rome. It was a room full of memory, danger, and military vigilance. The soldiers stationed there saw themselves as tough border troops, as men who made the prosperity of Italy and the tranquility of the capital possible through their service. While senators debated in Rome and emperors ruled in palaces, they stood in the camps on the Rhine, ready against Germanic groups, uprisings, and border conflicts. This experience shaped her self-confidence. They did not consider themselves interchangeable tools of the capital, but a supporting pillar of the empire. When Nero was overthrown and Galba took over, these legions did not feel sufficiently appreciated. They had crushed the uprising of the Vindex and thus ended a dangerous rebellion in Gaul. But Galba didn't treat them like saviors of order. He came from Spain, relied on other networks, and showed little sense of the pride of the Germanic armies. This was an insult to the soldiers. They saw that a governor from a province could become emperor. They saw that the Senate was only confirming what the military and political situation had already enforced. This gave rise to a simple but momentous question. If the Spanish troops and political allies could carry Galba, why should the Rhine legions not produce an emperor of their own? Vitellius offered himself as a candidate, although at first glance he did not seem like a man destined to be the savior of the empire. He came from a respected family and had a traditional career. His father Lucius Vitellius had been an influential man under previous emperors. Aulus Vitellius himself had held various offices and had social connections. But his reputation was contradictory. Later sources often portray him as hedonistic, weak and excessive, a man of food, drink, and comfort. These depictions are strongly influenced by the later victor's perspective, because Flavian historiography had little interest in making Vitellius appear fair. Nevertheless, he does not seem to have been a strict, ascetic military leader. He was rather approachable, friendly, generous, and able to win over soldiers through personal proximity. It was precisely these characteristics that made him attractive to the Rhine legions. After Galba's coldness and thriftiness, Vitellius appeared as a man who understood that soldiers wanted recognition. He was comradely, sympathetic to their expectations, and seemed less distant than the old senator on the throne. For legionnaires, such an impression could be decisive. For them, the emperor was not just an abstract authority, but the supreme warlord, whose generosity and respect confirmed their position. Vitellius didn't have to be a genius to take advantage of this mood. He just had to look different from Galba. In a situation of general disappointment, this was enough to trigger a political movement. At the beginning of January 69, the troops in Germania refused full loyalty to Galba. The situation escalated quickly. The legions in Lower Germania elevated Vitellius to emperor, and the troops in Upper Germania followed. This created an anti-emperor whose power base was not in Rome, but on the military border. That was a decisive moment in the year of the four emperors. While Galba in Rome still believed that he could stabilize his rule by adopting Piso, his authority in the north had already been broken. The soldiers had not waited for a decision from the Senate. They had acted themselves. Vitellius himself does not seem to have been completely actively driven by his elevation at first. He was the center of a military movement rather than its sole architect. The real energy lay with the legions and their officers. Men such as Aulus Caecina Aelianus and Fabius Valens, who emerged as leading commanders of the Vitellian cause, were particularly important. They understood that a claim to the throne was only meaningful if it was quickly enforced militarily. An anti-emperor in Germania could not win Rome by proclamation alone. He had to march to Italy. A regional uprising thus turned into a civil war. The decision to march south was strategic, but it also revealed the risks of the system. The Rhine legions, which were supposed to secure the border, were now drawn into an intra-Roman power struggle. Troops that were supposed to protect the empire from external threats soon fought against other Roman soldiers. This was one of the most bitter truths of the year 69. Rome's military strength could be directed against Rome itself. The discipline, organization, and fighting power of the legions that had made the empire great became a danger to its own order in the civil war. Vitellius' claim was based on several elements. He could rely on the strength of the Germanic armies, on their pride, and on their anger at Galba. He was also able to claim that Galba had betrayed the expectations of the soldiers, and therefore could no longer be considered a legitimate ruler. When Galba was overthrown by Otho in Rome, the situation changed again. Vitellius had originally started his rebellion against Galba. But suddenly Galba was no longer sitting on the throne, but Otho. Thus, a conflict between Galba and the Rhine legions became a fight between two new military emperors. Otho had been raised by the Praetorian Guard and the forces in Rome, Vitellius by the legions in Germania. Both embodied different centers of power in the empire. For Vitellius, Otho's elevation was both an opportunity and a challenge. On the one hand, Galba, the old emperor, had been eliminated. On the other hand, Otho could now try to present himself as the legitimately recognized ruler of Rome. He had the capital, the Senate, and the immediate imperial infrastructure on his side. Vitellius, on the other hand, had the stronger field troops, but not the symbolic center. The conflict thus became a fundamental question. Did it matter more who controlled Rome or who led the more powerful legions? The answer should not be through law or debate, but on the streets of northern Italy and on the battlefields around Bedriacum. Vitellius remained largely in the background during the first military phase, while his troop commanders organized the advance. This was practical on the one hand, but politically problematic on the other. An emperor who lets others fight for his power is dependent on their success and loyalty. Caecina and Valens led strong, but not always easy to control units. Their soldiers awaited booty, reward, and victory over Otho. The march to Italy was not only a military operation, but also a psychological process. The further the troops advanced, the stronger their claim to win the empire for their emperor grew. A retreat or compromise became increasingly difficult. The Vitellian movement was therefore characterized by military self-confidence from the very beginning. These soldiers believed that they had a right to enforce their election. They did not see themselves as rebels, but as men who corrected an undignified situation. In their eyes, Galba had failed. Otho was a murderer and palace emperor, and Vitellius was the candidate of the true legions. This view was, of course, partisan, but it was effective. Civil wars do not only live on orders, but on convictions, justifications, and enemy images. Everyone had to believe that they were not fighting for mere ambition, but for a just cause. At the same time, Vitellius' rise revealed the weakness of the Roman succession order. There was no clear authority that could decide in a generally accepted way. The Senate could recognize, but not enforce. The Praetorians could kill in Rome, but they could not automatically control the empire. The provincial legions could proclaim an emperor, but had to enforce him militarily. This created parallel legitimacies that were mutually exclusive. Vitellius was emperor in Germania, Otho in Rome. The empire had two masters, and an empire of this size could not live with two supreme powers in the long run. Vitellius as a person remains difficult to grasp. Was he a weak man who was raised to the shield by his troops? Was he an opportunistic aristocrat who took advantage of a historic opportunity? Or was he above all a symbol of the power of the border armies? He was probably a bit of everything. He was not the great architect of the crisis, but he became one of its most important supporters. Without the discontent of the Rhine legions, he would hardly have become emperor. Without his willingness to accept this uprising, the crisis might have taken a different form. He was neither a mere tool nor a sovereign master of events. He swam on a wave that was stronger than himself. When his troops advanced into Italy, the year of the 4 emperors had finally become an open civil war. The situation was no longer determined by intrigues in the palace, no longer by Senate resolutions or adoptions, but by marching columns, field signs, supplies, commanders, and battle plans. Vitellius, the emperor of the Rhine legions, embodied the new reality of the empire. A man could be proclaimed ruler far from Rome if enough soldiers stood behind him. But this power came at a price. It forced the empire to decide its internal conflicts with the weapons that were supposed to protect its borders. Vitellius' rise was therefore not only the story of an ambitious candidate, but a warning signal. Rome had learned that the legions could make emperors. Now it had to experience that they also marched against other Romans for this purpose. 7. Civil war in the heart of the empire. The power struggle between Otho and Vitellius finally turned the crisis of 69 into a civil war. By then, Rome had already experienced how quickly an emperor could be overthrown. Nero had fallen, Galba had been murdered, Otho had risen with the help of the Praetorians, and Vitellius had been proclaimed emperor by the Rhine legions. But now it was no longer just about intrigue, betrayal, and political recognition. Now Roman soldiers marched against Roman soldiers. The armies that were supposed to protect the borders of the empire were drawn into the interior of Italy. The empire turned its own military force against itself, and thus the power struggle took on a new, more dangerous quality. Italy had not been the natural battlefield of Roman armies for a long time. Since Augustus, the imperial order had seemingly overcome the civil war that had shaken the late republic. This had been one of the great promises of the Principate: peace at home, security at the borders, order under a strong ruler. Augustus had also justified his power by ending the bloody battles between Marius and Sulla, Caesar and Pompey, Antony and Octavian. But in 69 the old fear returned. Again, it was not laws, elections, or peaceful succession that decided the supreme power, but armies, banners, camps, and battles. For many Romans, this must have seemed like an eerie echo of the past. Otho was under enormous time pressure. He had done away with Galba in Rome and had been recognized by the Senate, but his rule was still young and inwardly uncertain. His power was mainly based on the Praetorian Guard, the troops available in Italy, and the control of the capital. Vitellius, on the other hand, had the battle-hardened Rhine legions at his disposal, which marched south under their commanders Aulus Caecina Aelianus and Fabius Valens. These troops were experienced, self-confident, and convinced that they were fighting not for a mere rebellion, but for an emperor whom they themselves saw as legitimate. Otho could not wait until his opponents had fully gathered their strength. He had to act before the military pressure became too great. The civil war therefore developed at great speed. Vitellius himself initially lagged behind his troops while his generals led the advance into Italy. Caecina crossed the Alps with part of the troops. Valens led other units on a different route. This movement showed how far the center of power of the empire had become from Rome. Decisions that had been made in the camps of Germania now rolled into Italy in the form of armed marching columns. Cities, municipalities, and local elites had to ask themselves who to follow. Those who chose the wrong side too early risked punishment later. Those who hesitated could be plundered by the troops passing through or considered unreliable. The civil war was not only a struggle of the emperors, but a test for all those who stood between the fronts. The situation was particularly difficult for Otho because he held the capital, but did not automatically have the best field troops. The Praetorians had been politically decisive in overthrowing Galba, but they were not as suited to large-scale campaigns as the frontier legions. A palace overthrow required determination and proximity to the center. A war against the Rhine troops required endurance, experience, marching discipline and tactical strength. Otho therefore had to try to bring together different forces: Praetorians, sailors, units from Italy and other troops who remained loyal to him or joined his cause. The question arose as to whether these units could be formed into an effective army quickly enough. At the same time, the war was a struggle for narratives. Otho had to present himself as a legitimate emperor, not as a mere murderer of Galba. Vitellius had to explain why his elevation by the Rhine legions was justified, although Rome and the Senate had meanwhile recognized Otho. Both sides needed moral justification. In a civil war, no one likes to fight openly for ambition alone. The soldiers were supposed to believe that they were fighting for order, honor, and the rightful ruler. Otho's supporters could say that Vitellius was a dangerous counter-emperor whose troops wanted to invade Italy. The Vitellians could claim that Otho was a traitor who had eliminated his predecessor by bribing and murder. Both images contained parts of the truth, but both served above all to legitimize their own violence. For the population of Italy, the advance of the armies meant fear and insecurity. Where soldiers passed through, burdens arose. They needed food, shelter, transport, and money. Even disciplined troops could be a heavy burden for towns and villages. In civil wars, the line between military supply and looting often becomes thin. Every place could suddenly become strategically important: every road, every bridge, every storehouse. The empire, which had promised Roman peace to the provinces for decades, now brought the war back to its own heartland. Northern Italy in particular became the decisive area. The Po Valley was strategically important because it controlled access to Italy and allowed movements between Alpine passes, major roads, and central cities. Whoever ruled this region could open or block the way to Rome. That's why the operations there are intensifying. The cities of Cremona and Bedriacum became names that remained closely associated with the year of the four emperors. Here it was to be seen whether Otho could maintain his young rule or whether Vitellius would fight his way to power through the strength of the Rhine legions. Otho himself found himself in a field of tension between determination and caution. Some of his advisors and generals urged rapid action. Others might have preferred to wait until more forces were brought in, for example from the Danube provinces, where Otho could expect support. Strategically, this question was decisive. A quick attack could defeat Vitellius's troops before they fully united. However, acting too early could also mean playing against experienced legionnaires with insufficiently prepared forces. In such moments, the cruelty of political crises becomes apparent. Those who wait appear weak. If you fight too early, you risk everything. The Vitellian troops, for their part, had great strengths, but also problems. They were battle-hardened and self-confident, but their movement over long distances required care and coordination. There were rivalries and tensions between the commanders. Caecina and Valens did not always act as perfectly uniform tools of a clear plan. Vitellius's cause was strong because it relied on powerful legions, but it also depended on personal ambition, discipline, and the ability to hold different units together. On this side, too, the Civil War was not just an orderly military campaign, but a mixture of strategy, pride, competition, and opportunity. At the heart of this conflict was the shocking fact that both armies were Roman. They spoke the same military language, wore similar equipment, wore similar signs, and fought under the same imperial heritage. Many soldiers could have stood together at the borders under different circumstances. Now they faced each other as enemies. This made the Civil War particularly bitter. It was not about fending off foreign powers, but about the question of which Roman power bloc would subjugate the other. Every victory weakened the empire at the same time, because Roman experience, Roman discipline, and Roman life were destroyed. For the Senate, this situation was humiliating. The old elite of Rome could advise, recognize, and formulate public approval, but they could not prevent the war. The Senate had accepted Otho, but the Rhine legions paid little attention to it. This made it clear how much the balance of power had shifted. In the Republican tradition, the Senate had been the intellectual center of the state. It remained important in the German Empire, but in an emergency, military power was decisive. The year of the four emperors mercilessly exposed this reality. Senatorial dignity could not stop marching columns. Otho also had to live with the moral shadow of his own seizure of power. Galba's assassination had given him the throne, but it made it difficult for him to act as a guarantor of order. His opponents could portray him at any time as a man who had come to power through treason and blood. At the same time, he had little choice but to invoke the legitimacy of the imperial office himself. This tension was typical of the year 69. Almost every claim to order was born of disorder. Each new emperor promised stability after he himself had been part of the destabilization. The closer the decision came, the more the war became a test of nerves. Messengers, rumors, and contradictory news spread uncertainty. In Rome, they were waiting for reports from the north. In the camps, speeches were made, sacrifices were made, orders were given, and fears were hidden. Soldiers knew that the outcome would decide not only the emperor, but also their own lives, rewards, and future. Those who were on the winning side could expect awards, money, and influence. Those who lost had to reckon with punishment, dismissal, or death. In this way, personal hope was combined with political violence. The civil war in the heart of the empire was therefore more than a military conflict between Otho and Vitellius. It was the visible consequence of a broken order of succession. Nero's death had created a void. Galba had not been able to fill it, Otho had seized it by force, and Vitellius challenged it with the legions. Each stage of the crisis made the next more likely. What had begun as a political collapse was now decided on the battlefields. At the end of this section, Rome is faced with a bitter truth. The empire was large, rich, and militarily superior, but its internal order depended on the question of whether the armed forces recognized the same ruler. As soon as several armies supported different emperors, the strength of the empire turned into a danger. The civil war between Otho and Vitellius showed that Rome's power was not only threatened at its borders, but could break from within. The decision was approaching, and it was to be made at Bedriacum, where Roman soldiers faced each other to determine which emperor was allowed to stay and which had to disappear. 8. The Battles of Bedriacum. Bedriacum was not a place that seemed destined to go down in history on its own. It was not a cosmopolitan city, not a holy center, not an ancient scene of Roman greatness. And yet, in 69 AD, the area around Bedriacum became a symbol of the empire's self-destruction. Here in northern Italy, between roads, fields, camps, and cities, Roman soldiers met Roman soldiers. Here the battle between Otho and Vitellius was decided, later again the fight between Vitellius and the followers of Vespasian. Bedriacum thus became a name that stood for the bitter truth of the year of the four emperors. Rome was strong enough to rule the world, but not always strong enough to protect itself from its own power struggle. The first Battle of Bedriacum arose from the rapid advance of the Vitellian troops into Italy. The Rhine legions and their allies were convinced that they were not only fighting for Vitellius, but for their own honor. They had rejected Galba because they felt ignored, and they saw Otho as a man who had won the throne through murder and bribery. On the other side were Otho's troops, including Praetorians, sailors, and units at his disposal in Italy. They, too, were fighting not only for an abstract idea, but for their future. Otho had given them recognition, and if he won, they could hope for rewards, security, and influence. If he lost, they were the men of a failed emperor, and that could be dangerous in a civil war. The situation before the battle was marked by uncertainty. Otho had good reasons to seek a quick decision, but equally good reasons to be cautious. Other forces could have strengthened him, especially from the Danube provinces, where he was inclined to support. If he had gained time, the balance of power might have changed. But time was a risky commodity in the civil war. Every day could weaken morale, multiply rumors, and strengthen the opponent. Vitellius generals Caecina and Valens pushed south, and Otho had to fear that a long hesitation would be interpreted as weakness. In addition, his reign was young. An emperor who did not act decisively immediately after coming to power could quickly give the impression that he was not up to the pressure. So both sides moved towards a decision. The Po Valley became a military space in which not only armies but also political hopes were condensed. Roads, rivers, bridges, and cities suddenly took on the highest importance. Cremona, Placentia, and Bedriacum became points on a map on which the fate of the empire could depend. This landscape showed how much Roman warfare lived from organization. Supplies had to be secured, camps had to be set up, messengers had to be sent, troops had to be coordinated. But at the same time, the civil war could never be fully planned. Ambitious commanders, exhausted soldiers, misunderstandings, rumors, and personal rivalries could derail any strategy. Otho's generals were faced with the difficult task of leading an army that was politically determined, but not equally militarily experienced in all parts. The Praetorians were brave and influential, but they were not identical with the hard-trained frontier legions that had long served in Germania. The Vitellian troops, on the other hand, had strong combat experience, but they were not free of tension either. Their commanders, Caecina and Valens, had vanities of their own, and the movement of their units was not always uniform. Nevertheless, there was a psychological advantage with the Vitellians. They came as men who had taken their own power, and their march to Italy had increased their self-confidence. They believed that victory was theirs. The first decision was made in April 69. The fighting at Bedriacum and in the surrounding area was hard, confusing, and characterized by that special cruelty that often accompanies civil wars. For the enemy was not a foreign people whose language, customs, or gods were despised. The opponent was another Roman. Perhaps he had served in a similar unit, perhaps he had learned the same forms of command, perhaps he had sworn the same oath, only to a different emperor. It was precisely this closeness that did not make the struggle milder, but often more bitter. Those who fight against their own political mirror must convince themselves that the other is not simply an opponent, but a traitor. In this way, common origins become an additional reason for hatred. Otho's troops fought with great determination, but the Vitellian side prevailed. The exact movements of the battle are not always easy to reconstruct in the ancient accounts, but the result was clear. Otho's army was defeated. This defeat was not only a military setback, but a political verdict. Otho had to base his rule on quick recognition and military assertion. Now he had lost the decisive test. He still had followers, and it might not have been impossible to continue the war. More troops were on the way, and another ruler might have tried to gain time, gather new strength, and prolong the conflict. But Otho made a different decision. His behavior after the defeat is one of the most remarkable moments of the Four Emperors' Year. Otho decided not to continue the war. He took his own life on April 16, 69. The ancient sources often depict this death with a certain respect, even if they are otherwise critical of Otho, because there was a political message in his suicide. He apparently wanted to avoid further bloodshed and spare his supporters a continuation of the civil war. Whether this was done out of genuine responsibility, out of desperation, out of a Roman sense of honor, or out of a mixture of all these motives cannot be definitively determined. But his decision changed his image. The man who had come to the throne by betraying Galba now died with a gesture that many could interpret as self-control and sacrifice. With Otho's death, Vitellius was initially victorious. The Rhine legions had proven that they could prevail against the emperor in Rome. This was a triumph, but also a dangerous precedent. The victory at Bedriacum showed every army in the empire that military determination could conquer the throne. What the Germanic legions had done for Vitellius, other armies could repeat for another candidate. This is exactly what was to happen a little later. Bedriacum was therefore not the end of the crisis, but only its first major climax. Vitellius' victory also did not bring any real reconciliation. The defeated troops had to be integrated, disarmed, or monitored. The victors expected rewards. Italy had had to endure the passage and the fighting of the armies. Rome was waiting for the new emperor, but the capital could not be sure whether peace would now return. A ruler who came to power through civil war always had to prove that he was more than the candidate of a victorious army. Vitellius had won the battle, but he inherited a wounded empire, a tense capital, and a political world in which the example of his own uprising could encourage others. It is precisely for this reason that Bedriacum acquired a second, equally gloomy meaning in the same year. When Vespasian was proclaimed emperor in the east, a new front formed against Vitellius. Again, Roman armies stood against each other. Again, northern Italy became the decision-making area. Again, the area around Bedriacum played a central role. The second battle, in October 69, was part of the battle between the supporters of Vitellius and the troops marching for Vespasian. The Danube legions in particular now played an important role. They had seen how the Rhine legions had made an emperor and were not prepared to stand behind them permanently. Here, too, it was about politics, but also about honor, rank, and military self-confidence. The Second Battle of Bedriacum was again bloody and destructive. The Vitellian forces were defeated, and Cremona in particular suffered severe devastation. The city, which was close to the scene of the fighting, was plundered and burned by the violence of a war it had not caused. This showed another cruel side of the civil war. It was not only soldiers who paid the price for the fight for the throne. Cities, merchants, families, and local communities were also drawn into the maelstrom. A decision made in the camps and palaces could mean hunger, fire, looting, and death for a city in northern Italy. Bedriacum therefore stands for more than two military conflicts. It stands for the transformation of political uncertainty into physical violence. It stands for the moment when the Roman order damaged its own foundations. The legions had been created to protect the empire. In Bedriacum, they proved their strength against each other. The discipline that had made Rome great became a weapon in the internal power struggle. The roads that connected the empire were now used for the march of civil war armies. The cities that were to benefit from the Roman peace became victims of Roman rivalry. For the political history of the empire, Bedriacum was a lesson of the utmost importance. It showed that an emperor who was supported by only one part of the army could be challenged at any time by another military bloc. It showed that the capital alone was not enough when the provincial armies objected. But it also showed that military victory alone did not guarantee lasting order. Vitellius won the first decision and lost everything himself a few months later. The throne, which was conquered by force, remained threatened by violence. In the end, Bedriacum remains as a dark mirror of Roman power. Here it became apparent how closely size and danger were connected. The empire had massive armies, experienced commanders, and an impressive infrastructure. But when the political center broke up, all these strengths could work against each other. Bedriacum was not a marginal event, but a warning signal. It showed that Rome was vulnerable not only to external enemies, but to the unresolved question of who had the right to rule over everyone else. In 69, the Romans answered this question not with justice, not with tradition, and not with quiet succession, but with blood on Italian soil. 9. Rome between fear, hunger, and political violence. While armies marched in northern Italy and Roman soldiers fought Roman soldiers at Bedriacum, Rome itself lived in a state of tense unrest. The capital was not just a place of temples, palaces, triumphal arches, and public squares. It was a huge, sensitive organism, dependent on supplies, rumors, political staging, and the trust that there was a power somewhere that could guarantee order. In the year 69 AD, however, it was precisely this trust that was shaken. Within a few months, Rome had witnessed the death of Nero, the arrival of Galba, his assassination, the reign of Otho, and finally the victory of Vitellius. Each new emperor promised peace. Each new change of power proved the opposite. For the inhabitants of the city, politics was not just a matter for senators and soldiers. They felt the crisis in everyday life. Rome was a huge metropolis whose population could only be fed by constant supplies. Grain from Sicily, North Africa, and especially Egypt was vital. The city could not simply be supplied from its surrounding area. Its size was a sign of imperial power, but at the same time a weakness. When sea routes became unsafe, when political struggles paralyzed the administration, or when an anti-emperor gained control of important provinces, a crisis of the throne could very quickly turn into a supply crisis. Hunger was never just a social problem in Rome. Hunger was politically explosive. The Roman population expected not only military victories and magnificent buildings from the emperor, but also bread, games, security, and visible generosity. Since the late Republic, leading men had learned that the mass of the capital had to be taken seriously. Whoever ruled Rome had to secure the grain supply, avoid public unrest, and create the feeling that the state was functioning. Despite his political cruelty, Nero had understood the importance of public staging. He had organized games, distributed gifts, and presented himself to the people as an accessible ruler. Many simple people remembered this splendor, even if the upper class despised it. Galba, on the other hand, seemed cold, strict, and stingy. Otho hardly had time to build up his own relationship with the population. Vitellius came as the victor of the Rhine legions, but he also had to prove that he could not only be an emperor of soldiers, but an emperor of Rome. The fear in the capital had many faces. Senators feared that they had been on the wrong side. Knights and officials worried about their offices. Rich families cautiously observed whether new confiscations were imminent. Traders did not know whether the political situation would influence the flow of goods and prices. The common people heard rumors of battles, troop movements, and new acts of violence, without always knowing what news was true. In an era without fast and reliable communication, rumors could be more powerful than official announcements. A victory, a defeat, an alleged betrayal, a murder in the palace, or an uprising in a province could change the mood of the city within a few hours. Particularly stressful was the experience that violence had penetrated into the center of Rome. Galba had not fallen on a distant battlefield, but in the capital itself, on the Forum, the symbolic heart of the Roman public. His death showed the inhabitants that even the emperor was no longer safe in the space of the old republican dignity. The place where political speeches, trials, religious acts, and public decisions had once taken place became the scene of imperial bloodshed. This was more than a murder. It was a sign that order could no longer protect its most sacred stages. The Praetorian Guard played a central role in this. This elite unit was actually there to protect the emperor and ensure the security of the capital. But in the year of the 4 emperors, she herself became a political actor of the highest danger. The Praetorians had abandoned Nero, seen Galba disappointed, raised Otho, and had to come to terms with a new Vitellian power after his defeat. This was worrying for the city. The men who were supposed to guarantee order had proven that they could make emperors and kill. Their loyalty was no longer a matter of course, but depended on promises, money, honor, and the assessment of who would prevail. When Vitellius was considered victorious after Otho's death, many Romans hoped for an end to the fighting. But his entry and the rule of his followers did not immediately bring peace. The soldiers who had carried him to power expected a reward. They did not come as silent servants of an abstract state order, but as victors of a civil war. Winners want recognition, provision, and loot. The presence of such troops could be threatening for the capital. Vitellius had to satisfy his soldiers without completely handing Rome over to the arbitrariness of military claims. This was a difficult task, and it is doubtful whether he was up to it. The ancient sources often portray Vitellius as an excessive, indulgent, and weak ruler. You have to be careful with such representations, because they come from a world in which the victor shaped memory. The Flavians who ruled after Vitellius had an interest in making him appear as an incompetent antithesis to Vespasian. Nevertheless, his short government does indeed show clear weaknesses. Vitellius could not convincingly dispel the impression that he had come to power mainly through the violence of his legions. He had no strong dynastic legitimacy, no great idea of reform, and no quiet authority. His government was overshadowed by civil war from the beginning. In Rome, political violence did not always mean open battle. It often manifested itself more subtly, in denunciations, in the fear of lists, in the uncertainty about old loyalties. Those who had supported Galba had to wonder if Vitellius would distrust him. Those who had served Otho could hope to be pardoned, but at the same time feared revenge. Anyone who greeted Vitellius too early could be endangered later if a new candidate won. Every public gesture became political. A word in the Senate, a participation in a ceremony, too loud a cheer or too cool a silence could later be used against someone. In such an atmosphere, social life is poisoned. People begin to stop speaking openly. Friendships are becoming more cautious. Families advise which side is safer. Ambition mixes with fear. The Senate was also in a humiliating position. Its members continued to represent the dignity, tradition, and experience of the Roman state to the outside world. But events showed how limited their actual power was. The Senate could recognize Kaiser, award titles, decide on thanks and award honors. But he could not prevent soldiers from killing Galba. He could not prevent the Rhine legions from raising Vitellius. He could not prevent Italy from becoming a battlefield. Many senators therefore had to adapt in order to survive. They condemned the fallen man, greeted the victor, and hoped that no one would later hold them responsible for earlier words. This adaptation may seem cowardly, but it has often been a survival strategy in a deadly crisis. Kaiser, on the other hand, judged the ordinary population less on constitutional legitimacy than on noticeable effect. Was there bread? Was there peace? Were there games? Will prices remain bearable? Were soldiers checked? Was the city protected? An emperor who fulfilled these expectations could find approval even after a violent seizure of power. An emperor who disappointed her quickly lost reputation. That's why care was so crucial. Rome lived in constant dependence on the Mediterranean. Control over Egypt was particularly important because large quantities of grain came from there. Later, when Vespasian rose in the east and the supply lines played a political role, it became clear that power over Rome could be exercised not only with swords, but also with grain ships. Hunger or the fear of hunger could be more dangerous than a speech in the Senate. A hungry crowd was unpredictable. Earlier times had already shown that grain shortages could trigger unrest. The emperors knew that the capital could not stand against them permanently. Therefore, the cura annoni, the concern for the grain supply, was a core of imperial rule. In the year of the 4 emperors, this truth became even more visible. If you wanted to rule Rome, you not only had to convince legions, but also calm the belly of the city. Political power had a very concrete basis: granaries, ports, ships, officials, transport routes, and prices. In addition to fear and the supply crisis, propaganda played a major role. Every emperor had to present himself as a savior. Galba had presented himself as the liberator of Nero, Otho as legitimate ruler after Galba's failure, Vitellius as a candidate of the strong legions and as a victor over the alleged murderer Otho. Later, Vespasian would present himself as a man of order, sobriety, and restoration. These self-portrayals were not incidental. In an empire that consisted of many provinces, languages, and interests, rule had to be told. Coins, edicts, public ceremonies, oaths, and rumors formed a political network. Those who controlled the interpretation of events could gain loyalty. Anyone who was considered weak, stingy, cruel, or ridiculous lost it. But no propaganda could completely cover up the violence. Rome had seen how quickly the names of the rulers changed. Pictures and statues could be erected and removed again. Coins could show the new emperor while people still remembered the old one. Oaths could be sworn anew, although the last oath had hardly faded away. This rapid succession undermined the aura of the empire. If each new ruler could soon disappear again, allegiance became more tactical. People waited, observed, adapted. This was dangerous for a system of rule based on public loyalty and religious political reverence. So the city of Rome was not just a spectator this year. It was stage, prey, target, and means of pressure at the same time. Whoever held Rome owned the symbolic center of the empire. But anyone who only held Rome without controlling the armies and supplies was vulnerable. Galba had reached Rome and yet had been overthrown. Otho had controlled Rome and still lost at Bedriacum. Vitellius could come to Rome victorious, but his power remained uncertain as long as other armies did not recognize him. The capital was necessary, but not sufficient. This was one of the most important lessons of the year 69. Between fear, hunger, and political violence, Rome became a mirror of the entire imperial crisis. In the streets of the city, the consequences of further decisions intensified. What was decided on the Rhine, what happened in northern Italy, what was prepared in Egypt or Syria, had an impact on the life of the capital. The civil war was not an abstract struggle between big names. He determined who was safe, who got food, who made a career, who kept silent, who rejoiced and who had to die. At the end of this chapter there is a city that was still the mistress of the world on the outside, but felt its dependence on the inside as rarely before. Rome had temples, senate, people, palaces, and memories of great victories. But in 69, it had to realize that its power was carried by forces it did not fully control: legions on distant frontiers, grain from overseas, ambitious commanders, and soldiers whose loyalty could no longer be taken for granted. The capital waited for order, but order could not be talked into. It had to be forced, paid, organized, and made credible. Vitellius had won the way to Rome after Bedriacum, but the fear remained. In the meantime, the people in the city had learned that an emperor could come, only to be ousted by a new name a little later. 10. Vespasian, the rise from the east. While Vitellius appeared victorious in Rome and many hoped that the empire would finally come to rest after the bloody battles, the next threat to his rule was already emerging in the east. There stood Titus Flavius Vespasianus, an experienced general who outwardly possessed little of the splendor associated with imperial dignity, but who embodied precisely those qualities that Rome desperately needed after months of violence. Vespasian was sober, practical, militarily experienced, and politically cautious. He did not come from the oldest top of the Roman aristocracy, but from a family that had only achieved its rise through service, administration, and military achievement. This is precisely what made him a credible man of the new reality for many. In an empire where old names alone no longer offered security, a successful commander from the provinces could promise more stability than a noble but weak emperor in Rome. Vespasian's rise was not sudden. He had a long career behind him, which had taken him through various offices and military tasks. Under Claudius he had distinguished himself in the conquest of Britain. Later he had held political offices and finally received the order from Nero to put down the great Jewish uprising. This war in Judea was of considerable importance to Rome. He tied up strong troops, demanded strategic patience, and made high demands on command and supply. Vespasian proved to be a capable commander there. He was not a man of grand theatrical gestures, but one who proceeded slowly, methodically, and with military severity. While other men in Rome fought for recognition, titles, and proximity to the palace, Vespasian stood with his legions in the east and waged a real war. It was precisely this position that made him so important in 69. The east of the empire was not just a distant arena. He was rich, strategically important, and politically powerful. Syria, Judea, and especially Egypt formed areas without which no emperor could rule safely in the long term. There were strong Roman troops in Syria. Egypt was one of the most important granaries of the empire. Alexandria was a center of trade, culture, and supply. Whoever controlled Egypt could influence Rome's grain supply. In a capital that depended on grain deliveries, this was a formidable political weapon. Vespasian therefore not only possessed military forces, but also access to a means of power that could be dangerous for Vitellius without the immediate need for a battle at the gates of Rome. After Otho's defeat and Vitellius' victory, the situation seemed to be decided at first. But many in the empire were not satisfied with Vitellius. His rule seemed like the rule of a victorious soldiers' party. The Rhine legions had made it, and their expectations weighed on it. In Rome, doubts arose as to whether he had the discipline, authority, and foresight to stabilize the empire after the crisis. His opponents could easily portray him as an excessive, weak man or dependent on his troops. Whether this picture was fair in all its details is less important than its political effect. An emperor who did not quickly create the impression of firm control after a civil war remained vulnerable. Vitellius had won, but he had not yet established order. In the east, the leading men watched this situation closely. Vespasian was careful enough not to be hasty. He had experienced how dangerous open rebellion could be if it was not supported by broad support. Galba had been overthrown. Otho had only been able to hold out for a few months. Vitellius owed his power above all to the Rhine legions. Anyone who now made a new claim had to make sure that he was not just another candidate among many, but had a real power base. Vespasian had this base, but it had to be put together politically. To do this, he needed allies who assessed not only his military strength, but also his chances throughout the empire. Gaius Licinius Mucianus, the governor of Syria, played a decisive role. Mucianus was an experienced, ambitious, and politically astute man. There had previously been tensions between him and Vespasian, but in 69 AD, they both realized that their collaboration offered greater opportunities than rivalry. Mucianus had influence, administrative experience, and troops. Vespasian had the reputation of a successful general in Judea and the loyalty of his legions. Together, they were able to shape the East into a power bloc that seriously challenged Vitellius. This connection was of great importance because it showed that Vespasian's rise was not just a spontaneous soldier's call, but a strategically prepared movement. Tiberius Julius Alexander, the prefect of Egypt, was also important. He recognized Vespasian early on and thus brought Egypt into his camp. That was a political breakthrough. With Egypt, Vespasian not only gained prestige, but also a means of exerting pressure on Rome. Control over grain deliveries could put Vitellius in a difficult position. The capital was sensitive to any disruption of supply. An emperor who could not feed Rome quickly lost authority. Vespasian thus combined military strategy with economic power. He understood, or had his advisors understand, that the path to the throne was not only through battlefields, but also through ports, warehouses, and supply lines. In the summer of 69, Vespasian was proclaimed emperor by his troops. This uprising differed from previous changes of power in one important respect. It was not based solely on discontent, but on a broad strategic constellation. The legions in Judea, the forces of Syria, and the support of Egypt combined to create a power base of considerable weight. In addition, Vespasian could appear as an antithesis to Vitellius. While Vitellius was portrayed as a bon vivant and candidate of the Rhine legions, Vespasian presented himself as a disciplined, experienced, and sober man of service. He was not a young courtier, not an ignored intriguer, not an old senator without military backing. He was a general who promised order in a real crisis. His origins played an interesting role in this. Vespasian did not belong to the oldest senatorial elite. For some aristocrats, this might be a flaw, but in the year 69 it could also be an advantage. The old political world had failed. Nero had soiled and ended the dynasty. Galba had not created stability with senatorial severity. Otho had ruled by palace power, Vitellius by the power of his border legions. Vespasian could appear as a man who rose not from courtly decadence, but from performance. His family, the Flavians, offered the chance for a new dynasty, but one that was not based on mythical proximity to Augustus, but on military success and practical ability to govern. Vespasian himself initially remained in the east. This was not cowardice, but strategy. He had to ensure the Jewish war, supplies, and political coordination. While Mucianus was to move west with troops, other forces in the empire were able to become active for Vespasian. The Danube legions in particular became decisive. They had their own interests and did not want to be inferior to the Rhine legions, which had helped Vitellius to power. In their eyes, Vitellius owed his position to a certain army group, not the entire empire. Vespasian offered them an opportunity to redefine the balance of power. Thus, his claim was not only supported by Eastern troops, but increasingly by other military groups that were dissatisfied with Vitellius or expected their own advantages. This once again shows the logic of the Year of the Four Emperors. The emperors were no longer legitimized only by descent or Senate decision, but by coalitions of armed power. Vespasian understood better than his predecessors how to form such a coalition. Galba had offended soldiers, Otho had relied on the Praetorians, Vitellius on the Rhine legions. Vespasian, on the other hand, connected several areas: the east, Egypt, Syria, Judea, and finally the Danube forces. His power base was broader. As a result, his claim seemed less like a regional uprising and more like a nationwide alternative. But even Vespasian's rise was not free of violence and interests. He was not an idealistic savior who acted only out of a sense of duty. He was a Roman power politician. He knew that an open claim to the throne would cost blood. He knew that another civil war was imminent. He also knew that his own troops were waiting for rewards, and his allies wanted to gain influence. His advantage was not that he stood outside the brutal logic of the year 69, but that he seemed to master it more clearly. He allowed power to emerge not only from a moment of indignation, but from planning, alliances, and control over key resources. For Vitellius, Vespasian's elevation was a heavy blow. Suddenly, his rule was no longer the solution to the crisis, but just another stopover. The East did not recognize him unanimously. Egypt slipped away from him. The Danube legions began to act against him. His opponents could now claim that Vespasian was the man who could really stabilize the empire. In Rome, the fear that the civil war would return had to grow again. The people had hardly begun to get used to a new emperor when the next claim appeared. As a result, the empire lost further sacral distance. It became visible as the price of a power struggle, as an office that could be seized, defended, and lost by men. Vespasian also benefited from its image of simplicity. Later traditions like to emphasize his thriftiness, his dry humor, his proximity to military practice, and his aversion to exaggerated courtly splendor. Of course, this image is also politically formed, because the Flavian rule deliberately wanted to distance itself from Nero and Vitellius. Nevertheless, it suited the location. After waste, murder, soldiers' uprisings, and uncertainty, many longed for an emperor who could restore order to finances, the army, and administration. Vespasian did not promise glamour, but stability. After a year of chaos, that was exactly a strong message. His rise from the east was therefore more than the next act in the civil war. It was the beginning of a new political order. With Vespasian, a man emerged whose legitimacy did not come from the old Julian Claudian family, but from military achievement, strategic control, and the ability to found a new dynasty. That was a turning point. The empire thus finally accepted that imperial rule was not tied to a single old family. A successful general from an ascended family could win the throne if he had enough armies, provinces, and resources behind him. While Vitellius was still trying to assert his rule in Rome, Vespasian had already laid the stronger foundations. He controlled important troops, won Egypt, collaborated with Mucianus, and became a beacon of hope for all those who distrusted Vitellius. The East, often considered distant from a Roman perspective, now became the starting point for deciding the entire empire. This showed how much Rome had become a world empire. The capital remained the symbolic center, but power could be formed from Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, or the camps on the Danube. At the end of this chapter, Vespasian stands as the man of the right moment. He had not been the first after Nero to claim the throne, and that was to his advantage. Galba, Otho, and Vitellius had worn each other out and showed the empire what could fail. Vespasian appeared when the longing for order was greater than the hope for splendor. His rise was cool, calculated, and carried by military power. But compared to the chaotic months before, this calculation seemed to many to be a salvation. The East had spoken, and its message was clear. Vitellius might possess Rome, but Vespasian had the means to force Rome. 11. The role of the legions, provinces, and Praetorians. The year of the four emperors was not only a struggle between four men who successively grasped for the highest power. It was above all a year in which the hidden forces of the Roman Empire became openly visible. Behind the names Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian were not simply personal ambitions, but entire power groups with their own interests, expectations, and possibilities for action. The legions on the frontiers, the provinces with their resources, and the Praetorian Guard in Rome determined the course of events far more than solemn resolutions of the Senate or old notions of aristocratic dignity. Anyone who wants to understand the year 69 must therefore understand that the empire was not only ruled from Rome. It thrived on a delicate balance between the capital, army, administration, supply, and regional centers of power. When this balance was broken, the imperial throne became the object of armed competition. The legions were the most important force. Since Augustus, the Roman army had become the decisive pillar of the empire. The emperor was not only the highest politician, but also the supreme commander. His power was based on the fact that the soldiers swore an oath of allegiance to him, that they recognized his name in the camps, and that they were willing to fight on his behalf. As long as this loyalty remained uniform, the empire seemed stable. But in the year 69, it became clear what happened when different army groups supported different emperors. Then the military strength of the empire became an internal danger. The legions were no longer just a shield against external enemies, but became political actors who could determine the ruler. This was particularly evident in the Rhine legions. These troops stood on a border that was of great symbolic and military importance to Rome. Since the catastrophe of Varus, Germania has been a space of vigilance, pride, and remembrance. The soldiers on the Rhine felt like tough border fighters who stood up for the security of the Reich on a daily basis. When Galba became emperor after Nero's death without showing them any special recognition, they felt this was a contempt. They had put down the Vindex uprising and expected their role to be appreciated. Instead, they saw an old senator from Spain on the throne who showed them little thanks. Political energy arose from this insult. The Rhine legions raised Vitellius, proving that an army far from Rome could produce its own emperor. But the Rhine legions were not the only troops with political self-confidence. The Danube legions also played a decisive role later. They watched closely how the Germanic armies had brought Vitellius to power. In the logic of military honor, one army group could not be permanently inferior to another. If the Rhine troops could make an emperor, why shouldn't the Danube troops also have a say in the fate of the empire? When Vespasian was proclaimed in the east, many of these soldiers found an opportunity in his cause to shift the balance of power anew. Their use against Vitellius was therefore not only an expression of political conviction, but also part of an internal competition between the major military zones of the empire. The legions did not act as completely free assemblies of the people, but also not as will-less tools of their commanders. A political atmosphere arose in the camps. Soldiers listened to speeches, talked about pay, booty, honor, and injustice, observed the weakness of the emperors, and compared their own situation with that of other troops. Commanders could steer these moods, but they also had to take them seriously. A general who ignored the expectations of his men risked mutiny or defection. That's why donatives, i.e. gifts of money when taking office, awards, and public recognition were so important. They were not a minor matter, but part of the political contract between the emperor and the army. Galba also failed because he did not want to speak this language of military loyalty. In addition to the legions, the provinces were decisive. In the 1st century AD, the Roman Empire was no longer a city-state with appendages, but a huge administrative structure whose wealth came from the provinces. Spain, Gaul, Germania, Africa, Syria, Egypt, Judea, Britain, and the Danube regions were not mere peripheral zones. They provided taxes, grain, soldiers, raw materials, and strategic depth. An emperor who controlled only Rome but lost important provinces was vulnerable. Conversely, a candidate who won several provinces could become dangerous even without direct control of the capital. This is exactly what Vespasian showed. His rise was not based on a rapid overthrow of the palace, but on the formation of a broad power block in the east. Egypt occupied a special position in this respect. The province was rich, strategically sensitive, and of great importance for the supply of Rome. The grain from Egypt was vital for the capital. Those who controlled Egypt could put pressure on Rome without immediately standing in front of its walls. Therefore, it was of enormous importance that the prefect of Egypt recognized Vespasian. This gave Vespasian's claim an economic and political strength that Vitellius could hardly compensate for. Power at that moment meant not only control over legions, but also over ships, ports, granaries, and administrative routes. The year of the four emperors showed that supplying the capital was as political as a battle. Syria and Judea were also central spaces. There were strong troops in Syria, and there was a man working there, Mucianus, who decisively supported Vespasian's rise. In Judea, Vespasian waged the war against the Jewish revolt and had thereby built up military authority. This eastern power base was more stable than the mere backing of a single guard or an isolated army group. Vespasian was able to combine several interests: the eastern legions, the administration of Syria, the control of Egypt, and later the support of the Danube forces. Therefore, in the end, his position was more viable than that of his predecessors. He understood that an emperor not only had to be proclaimed, but needed a network of resources, men, and regions behind him. The Praetorian Guard, on the other hand, was a different kind of power. It did not stand on the distant borders, but in the middle of the center. Her proximity to the emperor made her dangerous. The Praetorians were able to protect the palace, control access, influence uprisings in the capital, and overthrow the ruler at the decisive moment. Their behavior in 68 and 69 was of the utmost importance. They left Nero because his power was shattered and they were promised advantages under Galba. They turned against Galba because he refused to pay the promised money. They raised Otho because he took advantage of their disappointment and promised them recognition. The Guard thus became a visible symbol of a truth that shook Rome. The armed force in the center could not only protect the emperor, but also kill him. But the Praetorians had a limit. They could make an emperor in Rome, but they could not secure the whole empire on their own. Otho owed the throne to them, but this power was not sufficient against the Rhine legions. The Guard was politically powerful, but militarily not automatically stronger than experienced border armies. This was shown by the defeat against Vitellius. This made an important distinction visible. The Praetorians were able to provide immediate access to the capital, but the provincial legions were able to impose an emperor throughout the empire through their mass, combat experience, and regional power. A successful ruler therefore had to consider both dimensions: the proximity to the capital and the loyalty of the large armies. In this field of forces, the Senate often seemed like a venerable but powerless spectator. Of course, it was not meaningless. His recognition gave an emperor dignity, tradition, and legal form. Senators occupied important offices, administered provinces, and shaped the political culture. But at the moment of the decision, the Senate could not stop legions. He often had to confirm what soldiers had already enforced. Galba was recognized after Nero fell. Otho was recognized after Galba was murdered. Vitellius was recognized after Otho was dead. Later, Vespasian would also become an unavoidable reality through military success. Senatorial approval remained important, but it often came after the violence, not before it. This shift was painful for the Roman self-image. Rome had long drawn its political identity from the idea that the state was supported by laws, offices, the Senate, and public order. The empire had never completely abolished this tradition, but covered it up and reshaped it. In the year of the four emperors, however, it became apparent that under the facade of old forms, the army had the final decision-making power. An emperor had to present himself not only as the first citizen, but as the master of soldiers, payments, provinces, and supplies. When these elements broke apart, any solemn facade became worthless. The provinces had a double role in this process. On the one hand, they were scenes of military power building. Galba's rise began in Spain, Vitellius in Germania, and Vespasian in the east. On the other hand, they were not just a backdrop, but independent areas of interest. Local elites had to decide to whom they swore allegiance. Cities had to supply troops. Governors had to weigh up whether to wait or take sides. Every decision was risky. Those who supported the winner early could benefit. Those who bet on the loser lost their rank, fortune, or life. Thus, the crisis spread throughout the empire, even where no battle was fought. The year of the 4 emperors was therefore a lesson in the true structure of Roman power. Rome was the symbol, but not only the source of the rule. The legions were the power, but they were not able to act without supplies and leadership. The provinces were resource spaces, but also political actors. The Praetorians were the guardians of the center, but at the same time a threat to every weak emperor. The Senate was the voice of tradition, but not the arbiter of violence. An emperor had to balance all these forces. Anyone who underestimated one of them could fall. Galba underestimated the soldiers and paid with his life. Otho won the Praetorians, but not the military breadth of the empire. Vitellius won the Rhine legions, but not permanently the other centers of power. Vespasian eventually prevailed because he connected several levels: Eastern legions, important provinces, Egyptian grain, political allies, and the support of other armies. His success was not a coincidence, but the result of a better power architecture. Thus, the year 69 showed that the Roman emperor was not simply the man who sat in the palace. It was the hub of a vast network. When this network held, its power seemed self-evident. When it cracked, the emperor became a prisoner of the forces that were supposed to carry him. Legions, provinces, and Praetorians were not only instruments of rule, they were the conditions of their existence. In the year of the 4 emperors, they stepped out of the background and openly decided on the fate of Rome. From then on, no emperor could forget what this year had proved. The throne was in Rome, but its foundations lay in the camps, ports, provinces, and granaries of the entire empire. 12. Propaganda, loyalty, and the question of legitimate power. In the year of the 4 emperors, the battle for Rome was not only decided on battlefields, in camps, and on the streets of the capital. It was also carried out in words, images, promises, and public gestures. Each of the men who reached for the rule in 69 AD had to do more than get soldiers behind them. He had to explain why he was allowed to be emperor. He had to present his power as legitimate, show his opponents as dangerous or unworthy, and make the people of the empire feel that his rule was not merely the result of violence. This is exactly where the meaning of propaganda begins. At a time when the dynastic order had broken down after Nero's death, the question of legitimate power became more urgent than ever. Those who did not have an undisputed claim to inheritance had to establish legitimacy. Since Augustus, Roman imperial rule has been based on a sensitive interplay of power and representation. The emperor was in fact the most powerful man in the empire, but he did not simply call himself king. The term king had negative connotations in Rome since early times, because it was reminiscent of tyranny, submission, and the end of civil freedom. Augustus had therefore created a finer form of autocracy. He appeared as princeps, as the first citizen, as protector of the state, as supreme military commander, and as guarantor of peace. This staging was not mere decoration. It was a part of the lordship itself. People were supposed to believe that the emperor did not stand against the Roman order, but embodied it. After Nero, this narrative was badly damaged. In the eyes of many senators, the last representative of the Julian Claudian dynasty had burdened the empire with arbitrariness, waste, and personal excess. His fall therefore opened not only a political gap, but also a narrative one. Galba tried to fill this gap with the language of ancient Roman virtues. He did not present himself as a revolutionary innovator, but as a restorer of austerity, thrift, and senatorial dignity. His propaganda lived from the contrast to Nero. Where Nero was considered wasteful, Galba wanted to be thrifty. Where Nero appeared to be theatrical, Galba wanted to appear serious. Where Nero had humiliated the old elite, Galba promised respect for tradition and order. This portrayal particularly appealed to those who had suffered under Nero or despised his rule. For many senators, Galba was initially a hope, because he gave the impression that the empire could return to a sober, morally purified form of rule. But Galba's problem was that his message did not reach everyone. What sounded like virtue to senators seemed like coal to soldiers. What was considered thrift in aristocratic circles appeared to the Praetorians as a broken promise. His refusal to pay the expected gift of money could be interpreted as a moral attitude, but it destroyed the loyalty of the men who were supposed to protect him in Rome. This showed a basic rule of Roman power. Propaganda could only be effective if it was compatible with the expectations of the decisive groups. An emperor was not only allowed to say that he was just and strict. At the same time, he had to make sure that his followers felt rewarded, seen, and safe. Galba spoke the language of the old order, but not the language of the new military reality. Otho proceeded differently. His seizure of power was burdened by treachery and violence, for he had overthrown Galba with the help of the Praetorians. Therefore, he had to create a narrative particularly quickly that did not make him appear as a mere murderer. He could argue that Galba had failed, that the soldiers had been betrayed, and that his own rule was a response to Galba's political blindness. At the same time, he tried to gain recognition from the Senate and reassure the city. Otho knew that naked violence alone was not enough. The murder of Galba had opened the door to the throne for him, but only a new legitimacy could prevent him from being immediately condemned as a usurper. Nero's memory also played a delicate role in this. Parts of the population, especially in Rome and perhaps also in some eastern areas, had not forgotten Nero despite everything. For them, he was not only the tyrant that many senators saw him as, but also an emperor of games, gifts, and public proximity. Otho had a connection to this world through his past. He was able to absorb certain Neronian moods without completely equating himself with Nero's failure. That was politically risky, but understandable. In a year of uncertainty, the memory of a well-known emperor, even a controversial one, could have emotional power. Otho had to show that he was not only a tool of the Praetorians, but a ruler who could restore stability to Rome. Vitellius, on the other hand, drew his legitimacy from the Rhine legions. His propaganda was the propaganda of military honor. He appeared as a candidate of those soldiers who felt ignored by Galba and regarded Otho as the illegitimate palace emperor. To his followers, Vitellius was not just a rebel, but the man raised by the battle-hardened frontier troops. This narrative was strong because the legions on the Rhine actually had a high level of prestige. They stood on a dangerous frontier, they had experience, and they saw themselves as true defenders of the empire. If such men made Vitellius emperor, this could be presented as an expression of military truth. Not the intrigues in Rome, but the voice of the legions was to decide. But Vitellius also had a problem. A rule that was too closely linked to a particular army group could appear to be partisan. He was the emperor of the Rhine legions, but had to become emperor of the entire empire. His opponents could portray him as a man who was dependent on his soldiers, as a bon vivant without discipline, as the victor of a civil war that did not embody a higher order. Whether these accusations were completely fair played a political role less than their effect. In the Roman world, the image of a ruler was decisive. An emperor had to radiate self-control, generosity, military authority, and concern for the community. Vitellius did not succeed in forming such a picture convincingly in the long term. Vespasian understood the power of representation particularly well, or at least his supporters understood it. He was able to present himself as a counterimage to the previous emperors of the year of chaos. Not as a spendthrift artist like Nero, not as an immobile old aristocrat like Galba, not as an Otho raised by palace power, and not as Vitellius dependent on the Rhine troops. Vespasian appeared as an experienced soldier, a sober administrator, and a man of order. His origin from an ascended family could even be interpreted positively. He did not stand for over-refined court culture, but for performance, discipline, and practical ability. After months of civil war, this message was effective. Many people no longer wanted glamour, but peace. Its legitimacy rested on several pillars. He had military successes, especially in the Jewish War. It was carried by the Eastern legions. He won the support of Syria, Egypt, and later the Danube forces. He had important resources, including control over Egypt's grain supply. This allowed his propaganda to appear more credible than mere assertion. Vespasian promised order and actually had the means to enforce it. He promised stability and was able to rely on a broader power base than his predecessors. It was precisely this combination of narrative and real power that made him dangerous for Vitellius and ultimately successful. In the Roman world, political messages spread in many ways. Coins played an important role. They bore the image of the emperor and short messages about peace, victory, harmony, freedom, or restoration. A coin was more than just a means of payment. It was a small piece of state propaganda that traveled through hands, markets, and provinces. Statues, public sacrifices, edicts, speeches, military oaths, and ceremonies also served to make rule visible. When a new emperor was recognized, pictures had to be exchanged, names had to be named, and loyalties had to be publicly renewed. Especially in the year of the 4 emperors, this practice was accelerated almost absurdly. No sooner had a ruler been depicted than he could have fallen again. This rapid succession damaged the aura of the empire. If Galba, Otho, and Vitellius came and went within a few months, the question arose as to what imperial legitimacy meant at all. Was emperor who was recognized by the Senate? Who was protected by the Praetorians? Who was called out of the strongest legions? Who controlled Rome? Who owned Egypt? Who won the civil war? The year 69 showed that there was no simple answer. Legitimacy consisted of several elements, and each could be played off against the other. Galba had the Senate and traditional dignity, but lost the soldiers. Otho had the capital and the Praetorians, but lost to the frontier legions. Vitellius had the Rhine troops, but lost the broader power base. Vespasian won because he was able to connect most of the elements in the end. Loyalty in this world was not just a matter of the heart. It was based on interests, habit, fear, hope, and conviction. A soldier could be loyal to an emperor because he promised him pay, booty, and honor. A senator could support him because he expected security for his family and rank. One city was able to join because it sought protection from punishment. One province could wait until it was clear who would win. This does not mean that there was no real loyalty. Many people actually believed in the legitimacy of their page. But in the Civil War, loyalty was constantly tested. Anyone who backed the wrong man too early could be destroyed. Anyone who changed too late was considered a traitor. In this atmosphere, political stance became a matter of survival. Propaganda helped to make such decisions morally bearable. Nobody wanted to see themselves as opportunists. Therefore, rulers and followers had to create narratives in which their side stood for order, justice, or the real Rome. Galba was the liberator of Nero. Otho was the avenger of broken promises and the ruler recognized by the Senate. Vitellius was the candidate of the honest border troops. Vespasian was the restorer of peace. Each of these stories contained a truth, but also a shortening. This is precisely the essence of political propaganda. It picks up on real experiences, arranges them one-sidedly, and transforms them into a message that is intended to move people to action. In the end, the question of legitimate power was not decided by words alone. It was decided by force. But violence needed a narrative to be accepted in the long term. Vespasian won not only because his followers were militarily successful, but because his rule after the victory could appear as the restoration of a necessary order. He had to turn the civil war into a founding story. The chaos of the year 69 was to give rise to Flavian stability. Military power was to become legitimate rule. A victor had to become an emperor. The year of the 4 emperors therefore taught Rome that power never consisted only of swords, but that it was not secure without swords either. Legitimacy had to be told, shown, paid for, and defended. An emperor needed images, words, rituals, and recognition, but all of this remained fragile when the armies turned away. Conversely, an army could raise a man, but only political staging made this man more than an armed usurper. The year 69 was the moment when this truth was ruthlessly revealed. Rome was looking for a rightful ruler, but in the end it recognized above all those who could credibly promise order and enforce it militarily. 13. The death of Vitellius and the end of chaos. When Vespasian was proclaimed emperor in the east, Vitellius was still lord of the capital, but his power was already beginning to crumble. At first glance, he possessed what every Roman emperor needed: the recognition of the Senate, control of Rome, the support of the soldiers who had carried him to the top after the victory over Otho, and the outward splendor of imperial rule. But beneath this surface, his position was weak. Vitellius had come to power through the Rhine legions, but he had not managed to turn this military victory into a lasting imperial order. He was the victor of a civil war, but not a generally accepted ruler of peace. It was precisely this weakness that became dangerous when Vespasian built up a broader and better organized power base against him. After the defeat and death of Otho, Vitellius initially had the chance to calm the empire. After months of murder, marching and hoping, many Romans finally wanted stability. A clever ruler could have used this longing to integrate old opponents, discipline the soldiers, take the Senate seriously, and show the provinces that the time of constant changes of emperor was over. But Vitellius did not succeed in this political transformation convincingly. His rule remained dependent on his origin. He was the emperor of the victorious Rhine troops, and these soldiers awaited their reward. They had fought for him, entered Italy, and defeated Otho. Now they wanted recognition, care, and influence. In doing so, the emperor himself became a prisoner of the forces that had raised him. In Rome, the impression grew that Vitellius was less a ruler of order than a man of dependencies. The ancient sources often describe him as excessive, comfortable, and pleasure-loving. One must read such depictions carefully, because they were strongly influenced by the later Flavian view, which wanted to make Vespasian appear as a sober savior and Vitellius as an unworthy predecessor. Nevertheless, it is clear that Vitellius did not seem politically energetic enough to rally the empire after the convulsions of the year. His court, his supporters, and his soldiers gave many the impression that the victory at Bedriacum had not led to calm, but had only created a new group of winners. For senators, civil servants, merchants, and ordinary citizens, the question remained open as to whether this emperor could really exist permanently. While Vitellius struggled for recognition in Rome, the countervailing power was forming in the east. Vespasian was supported by his legions in Judea, won Syria through cooperation with Mucianus, and received Egypt, one of the empire's most important means of power. Control over Egyptian grain was crucial not only economically, but politically. Rome was dependent on regular deliveries. Anyone who could influence these deliveries held a knife to the most sensitive point in the capital. So Vespasian did not have to be in Rome immediately to threaten Vitellius. His control of important provinces and supply lines already made it clear that Vitellius was no longer master of the entire imperial mechanics. The attitude of the Danube legions became even more important. These troops had watched with great attention as the Rhine legions had brought Vitellius to the throne. In a world of military honor, it was hardly conceivable that an army group would permanently claim the glory of having made the emperor, while other powerful armies just watched. The Danube troops had their own claims, their own pride, and their own interests. When Vespasian was proclaimed in the east, they found in him a candidate through whom they could act against Vitellius. Thus, the fight against Vitellius was not only waged from the east, but also from those forces that were in Central and Southeastern Europe and could open the way to Italy. Antonius Primus, an energetic and ambitious commander who acted for Vespasian's cause, became particularly important. While Vespasian himself remained in the east and Mucianus prepared the strategic framework, Antonius Primus pushed into Italy with the Danube legions. His approach was bold, perhaps even arbitrary, but militarily effective. He understood that speed was crucial. Vitellius was not allowed to have time to organize his forces and bring together all available troops. The war had to be carried into the heart of his sphere of influence before it could fully stabilize. This repeated a bitter dynamic of the year. Roman soldiers marched into Italy again, northern Italy became a battlefield again, and again the question of rule was not to be decided in the Senate, but by blood. The Second Battle of Bedriacum in October 69 was a turning point. There, the Vitellian forces met Vespasian's troops. It was another confrontation between Roman soldiers who recognized different emperors and yet belonged to the same empire. The Vitellian side fought to preserve a rule that had been achieved only a few months earlier. The Flavians fought for the man they portrayed as a better hope for order. In truth, both sides also fought for honor, reward, rank, and survival. Those who lost not only lost a battle, but also their political future. The fighting was hard and destructive. In the end, the troops of Vitellius were defeated. Cremona, an ancient and important city, was severely devastated. The civil war once again ate into Italy's body. With the defeat of his followers in northern Italy, Vitellius lost the military support that had supported his rule. He was still in Rome, but Rome alone was not enough. The year had already shown this several times. Galba had reached the capital and yet had been overthrown. Otho had controlled Rome and lost to the Rhine legions. Vitellius now sat in Rome, while Vespasian's forces drew nearer. His situation was almost hopeless, but it is precisely hopeless situations that often generate particularly dangerous violence. For a ruler who feels that his power is crumbling can either negotiate, flee, fight, or cling to the last signs of his dignity. Vitellius wavered. Tradition tells of attempts to resign from power or to achieve a kind of abdication. He is said to have been willing to relinquish power at times, perhaps in the hope of saving his life and preventing further bloodshed. But his surroundings, his supporters, and the dynamics of violence made an orderly retreat hardly possible. An emperor was not just a private person who could sign a contract and retire. Behind him stood soldiers, friends, beneficiaries, and guilty people, all of whom had to fear going down with him. Many had no interest in surrendering. For them, Vitellius' task did not mean peace, but possible loss, revenge, and death. So the fight in Rome remained dangerous. In the capital, the situation escalated dramatically. Vespasian's brother, Titus Flavius Sabinus, who held an important position as city prefect, apparently tried to support the transition in favor of the Flavians. But the situation escalated. Sabinus and his followers entrenched themselves on the Capitoline Hill, one of the holiest and most symbolic places in Rome. There stood the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, a religious and political heart of the Roman world. The fact that the civil war penetrated to this place showed how deeply the order was damaged. During the fighting, the capital was set on fire. The temple of Jupiter was destroyed. For Rome, this was a shock of symbolic significance that can hardly be overestimated. This was not just a building. It was a sign of the connection between Rome, its gods, and its world domination. The burning of the capital revealed the moral and religious catastrophe of the civil war. Rome could rule Gaul, Germania, Greece, Syria, and Egypt, but it could not even protect its own holiest center at that moment. The violence that had arisen from the struggle for the imperial throne attacked what the Romans themselves considered the foundation of their greatness. For Vespasian's later reign, the reconstruction of this temple was therefore more than just a building measure. It became a political sign of restoration. But in December 69, the fire was initially an expression of chaos. The city saw that the civil war not only cost human lives, but also violated the symbolic order of Rome itself. When the Flavian troops finally invaded Rome, the downfall of Vitellius became inevitable. The fighting in the city was fierce. Streets, squares, and buildings became spaces of military force. For the inhabitants of Rome, this must have been a horrific experience. The war, which had previously raged in the provinces and in northern Italy, now reached the center. Soldiers looked for opponents, supporters changed sides, old scores were settled, fear spread. In such moments, the boundaries between political cleansing, military necessity, personal revenge, and plunder become blurred. Rome was no longer just the capital, but a battlefield. Vitellius tried to hide, but he was found. His end was brutal and humiliating. The man who had been recognized as emperor a few months earlier was led through the streets, mocked, abused, and finally killed. His body was exposed to the usual signs of victorious violence. This ending showed the full cruelty of Roman power struggles. In the official language, the emperor was almost superhumanly exalted, surrounded by titles, honors, and images. But if he fell, that dignity could disappear in no time. The Lord of the world became a beaten body, at the mercy of hatred, triumph, and revenge. The death of Vitellius marked the end of the immediate succession of emperors in 69, but not simply the end of all problems. Rome was exhausted, Italy wounded, the armies had to be reorganized, the supporters of the losers had to be treated, and the authority of the state had to be restored. Vespasian was now the last remaining winner, but he faced a daunting task. He had to turn a civil war into a legitimate rule. He had to show that his victory was not just another act of violence in a series of acts of violence, but the beginning of a new order. This was precisely the challenge after the chaos. It was not victory alone that decided the future, but the ability to turn victory into stability. Nevertheless, the sinking of Vitellius had a clear meaning. He ended the open competition between the four emperors. Nero was dead, Galba murdered, Otho died by suicide, Vitellius killed by the victors. Vespasian remained. The Reich had made a brutal selection in a few months. Not by an orderly succession, not by calm deliberation, not by a constitutional procedure, but by insurrections, battles, betrayal, supply policy, and military coalitions. The throne belonged to the man who in the end had the strongest and broadest power base behind him. But precisely because Vespasian emerged from this chaos, he had to be careful. He was not only allowed to appear as another soldier emperor. He had to present himself as the restorer of Rome. The destruction of the capital, the violence in the city, the insecurity of supplies, and the exhaustion of the Senate offered him both a problem and an opportunity to do so. If he rebuilt Rome, put the finances in order, disciplined the army, and founded a new dynasty, he could gain legitimacy from the catastrophe. The civil war had exposed the old system. Vespasian now had to show that a new rule was possible. The end of Vitellius was therefore more than the death of a failed emperor. It was the moment when the year of the four emperors reached its last bloody act. The capital had seen how quickly imperial dignity could turn into disgrace. The armies had proven that they could make emperors and destroy them. The Senate had experienced that its recognition was important, but not decisive. The population had experienced how closely political power was linked to bread, security, and violence. And Vespasian had learned that the one who wanted to rule after such a year was not only allowed to win. He had to heal order and shape the memory of chaos in such a way that his own rule appeared to be the necessary response. With Vitellius' death, the year of the four emperors ended not in a moment of solemn reconciliation, but in blood, fire, and exhaustion. But it was precisely from this that the opportunity for a new stability arose. Rome had seen the abyss. Now a ruler was needed who could make it credible that this abyss would not open again immediately. Vespasian was this ruler not because he was free of violence, but because in the end he understood how violence had to be put in order. Chaos had devoured its last emperor. Now the difficult construction of the Flavian rule began. 14. The Flavian order, how Vespasian stabilized the empire. When Vitellius was dead and the fighting in Rome slowly died down, Vespasian was faced with a task that went far beyond the mere possession of the imperial dignity. He had won the power struggle, but victory alone did not make a stable rule. The empire was exhausted, the capital insecure, the Senate humiliated, the armies agitated, and Italy marked by civil war. Within a single year, Rome had seen four men act as emperors in succession, oaths of allegiance broken, rulers murdered, cities devastated, and holy places destroyed. The name Kaiser had lost its apparent inviolability. If Vespasian wanted to rule permanently, he had to do more than defeat his opponents. He had to prove to the empire that he was not just another victor of the civil war, but a ruler who could restore order. Vespasian understood this challenge better than Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. Galba had believed that strict morality could replace loyalty. Otho had quickly seized the throne, but had not had time to consolidate his power. Vitellius had triumphed through the Rhine legions, but had not built up a convincing order. Vespasian, on the other hand, knew that after a civil war, an emperor had to secure several foundations at once: the army, the finances, the Senate, the supply of Rome, the provinces, and public perception. He was not only allowed to appear as a general, but also had to act as a restorer of the state. His reign therefore began not with splendor, but with sober repairs. One of its most important tasks was to restore military discipline. The year of the four emperors had shown how dangerous armies could become if they saw themselves as political decision-makers. The legions had raised emperors, fought against each other, and devastated Italy. Vespasian also owed his own rise to military support, but precisely for this reason he had to prevent every army group from believing in the future that it could make new rulers at will. He had to reward his soldiers without giving them the impression that they were above the state. That was a difficult balancing act. Too little recognition would have generated discontent. Too much indulgence would have weakened the emperor's authority. Vespasian took a pragmatic approach. He reorganized troops, transferred units, dissolved dangerous concentrations of power, and made sure that no single army group remained too strongly associated with its own political aspirations. In particular, the legions, which had been on different sides in the Civil War, had to be reintegrated into a common empire structure. The emperor could not allow old enmities to live on in the camps and break out again in the next crisis. The army was to be the instrument of the emperor again, not the judge of the emperor. This was not achieved through words alone, but through pay, orders, transfers, discipline, and the clear message that the time of open military emperorship had to be over. Financial stabilization was just as important. Nero had burdened the state budget, the Civil War year had caused enormous costs, and each new ruler had to pay soldiers, repair damage, and secure administration. Even in ancient times, Vespasian was considered thrifty, sometimes even stingy. But after the experiences of the year 69, thriftiness was not a mere character trait, but a political necessity. No emperor could rule without money. Armies had to be supplied, officials paid, buildings restored, roads and ports maintained, and grain supplies secured. Vespasian increased revenues, reviewed privileges, and looked for new sources of money. His financial policy was not always popular, but it gave the state the ability to act again. This sobriety clearly distinguished him from Nero. Vespasian did not want to shine as an artist emperor, but as a man who made the Roman state functional again. This was precisely where his strength lay. After years of waste and months of violence, an emperor who brought order to the coffers, administration, and army could appear more credible than a ruler who only promised splendor. Vespasian understood that stability had to become visible. The people had to experience that taxes were collected, grain was delivered, soldiers were checked, and public tasks were fulfilled. Domination was not just an idea, but daily organization. The reconstruction of Rome played a special role in this. The burning of the Capitol during the fighting against Vitellius had been a heavy symbolic blow. The Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus was not just any building, but a sacred center of the Roman state religion and a sign of the connection between Rome, its gods, and its world domination. The fact that this place had been destroyed in the Civil War must have seemed like a bad omen. Vespasian had the reconstruction pushed forward and made it a sign of political renewal. If the temple resisted, the order of the kingdom would also stand. Destroyed stone became a message. Rome was wounded, but not fallen. Other construction projects also served this message. Later, the construction of the Flavian amphitheater, now known as the Colosseum, became particularly significant. It was built on an area that had previously been connected to Nero's enormous palace complex. In doing so, Vespasian sent a strong political signal. Where Nero had claimed space for his personal splendor, a public building for the people was now to be built. That was propaganda in stone. Vespasian presented himself as the antithesis of Nero, not the ruler who takes Rome for himself, but the emperor who gives something back to the city. Even though this project demonstrated power, it did so in a form that could generate public approval. Vespasian had to act cautiously vis-a-vis the Senate. In the year of the four emperors, the Senate had repeatedly been forced to recognize victors and condemn those who had been overthrown. His dignity was damaged, but his importance remained great. Vespasian could not ignore the Senate if he wanted to legitimize his rule permanently. He needed senatorial cooperation for administration, judiciary, provincial leadership, and public recognition. At the same time, he could not allow the Senate to question his military power. The solution was controlled involvement. The Senate was given respect, offices, and a role in the order of the empire, but the final power remained with the emperor. Vespasian had his position secured legally and publicly. His rule was not intended to act as a mere victory in the civil war, but as a recognized imperial order. He was helped by the fact that many did not want a new power struggle after the turmoil of 69. Even people who didn't love Vespasian could accept him if he brought calm. In times of crisis, legitimacy often arises not from enthusiasm, but from relief. After Nero, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, the desire for a reliable center was strong. Vespasian gave the empire just that, an emperor who stayed. Another central task was the founding of a new dynasty. The demise of the Julian Claudian line had opened the question of succession and thus made the chaos possible. Vespasian had to prevent the same uncertainty from breaking out again after his death. His sons Titus and Domitian were therefore of great political importance. They made it clear that the Flavian rule was not only to be a personal transitional solution, but a new imperial family. Titus had proven himself in the Jewish War and was increasingly groomed as a successor. This gave the empire a recognizable future again. The message was clear: after Vespasian, not every ambitious general should be able to make his claim again. The provinces also had to be reassured and involved. The year of the four emperors had shown how strong the power came from the provinces. Spain, Germania, the East, Egypt, and the Danube regions had all played a role. Vespasian knew that Rome could not rule against the provinces. He had to control governors, involve local elites, secure taxes, and show that the new rule did not only serve the capital. His power base was particularly strong in the East, but old Vitellian supporters also had to be integrated or neutralized in the West. Stability did not mean destroying every opponent. Too much revenge would have created new enmity. The wiser way was to involve useful men, remove dangerous ones, and let the administration work reliably again. The Jewish War also played into the Flavian legitimacy. Vespasian and Titus were able to show military success, which did not only consist of civil war. That was important. An emperor who justified his power only by defeating other Romans remained morally burdened. A victory over external or insurgent opponents, on the other hand, could be presented as service to the Reich. The capture of Jerusalem by Titus in the year 70 later became a central element of Flavian self-presentation. It showed the military strength of the new dynasty and steered the gaze away from civil war towards imperial triumph. Nevertheless, Vespasian's reign remained marked by the memory of the year 69. He knew that the armies had discovered the power of emperor-making. He knew that money, provision, and military loyalty could make the difference between the life and death of a ruler. That is why his government was not romantic, but realistic. He relied on control, revenue, discipline, public buildings, dynastic planning, and political sobriety. It was precisely these qualities that made him successful. He did not promise a return to an ideal past, but created a functional present. The Flavian order was therefore not a pure restoration of what had existed before Nero. It was an adaptation to the new realities. The empire remained a monarchy in the guise of old Roman forms, but now it was clearer than ever that military power, provinces, and supplies formed the foundations of this monarchy. Vespasian could not undo this. He could only ensure that these forces were once again under imperial control. That was the core of his stabilization. In the end, Vespasian succeeded in doing something that his three immediate predecessors had failed to do. He convicted violence in perpetuity. He turned a military victory into a recognized rule. He gave the Senate a role without leaving the final decision to it. He rewarded the army without openly relinquishing its rule. He used building policy, finances, and propaganda to create the image of an emperor who rebuilt Rome after the chaos. His government was not free of harshness, burdens, and self-interest, but it brought the empire what it needed most: predictability. Thus, the victor of the civil war became the founder of the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian showed that the empire did not have to collapse after the end of the Julian Claudian family. It could be renewed if a ruler understood the real basis of power. The year 69 had taught Rome how dangerous an empire without a secure center was. Vespasian gave him back this center. Not by magic, not by old ancestry, but by sober power politics, military order, and the firm will to build a new stability out of the ruins of the civil war. 15. The legacy of the year of the four emperors. Rome learns about the power of the armies. The year of the four emperors ended outwardly with the victory of Vespasian, but its real significance extended far beyond the year 69 AD. It was not just a brief period of Roman unrest, not just a dramatic succession of rulers, murders, battles, and political twists. It was a moment when the empire recognized itself. Behind the shining facade of Senate tradition, imperial dignity, and Roman world domination, it became clear what power was ultimately based on: armies, money, supplies, provinces, and the ability of a ruler to hold all these forces together. The year 69 showed Rome that although the imperial throne was in the capital, its foundations lay in the camps of the legions. Since Augustus, the Roman Empire had tried to cover up a difficult truth. Rome had effectively become monarchical, but it did not want to see itself as a simple royal rule. The emperor was princeps, first citizen, protector of peace, supreme general, and center of the state. The old republican forms continued to exist. The Senate met, magistrates were appointed, laws were formulated, religious rituals were performed. But behind this web of tradition and public presentation was the power of a single man. As long as this man came from a recognized dynasty, as long as the armies obeyed him, and as long as the supplies worked, the system could seem stable. With the death of Nero, this self-evident fact collapsed. The fall of the Julian Claudian dynasty was therefore a deep turning point. Augustus had created not only a form of government, but also a political narrative. His successors might be weak, cruel, capable, or contradictory, but they stood in a line that gave the imperial office special legitimacy. Nero destroyed this line not only biologically, because he left no suitable successor, but also morally, because his rule had antagonized many elites. When he died, no universally accepted mechanism remained. Rome knew how to obey an emperor, but it did not know for sure how to appoint a new emperor when the dynastic order had disappeared. In this gap, the violence of the year 69 unfolded. Galba embodied the attempt to stabilize the empire through old senatorial dignity and moral strictness. His failure showed that tradition alone was not enough. He had prestige, origin, and recognition, but he lost the soldiers. His refusal to meet the expectations of the Praetorians was more than a personal mistake. It was a misunderstanding of the power bases of the empire. A ruler could speak of virtue, but if the armed men around him felt betrayed, his virtue was no protection. Galba's death at the Forum was a cruel sign that imperial dignity was fragile without military loyalty. Otho, on the other hand, showed the power of the determined overthrow of the palace. He understood the disappointment of the Praetorians, took advantage of Galba's weakness, and reached for the throne. But his rule also proved the limitation of a power that was based primarily on the capital and the guard. Controlling Rome did not automatically mean controlling the empire. The Rhine legions had already raised Vitellius, and they were ready to assert their claim with arms. Otho was able to win the Senate, hold the city, and present himself as emperor, but this was not enough against the battle-hardened troops of the north. His defeat at Bedriacum showed that military strength from the provinces could force the decision in Italy. Vitellius made this truth even clearer. He was the emperor of the Rhine legions, the man who was brought to the throne by a powerful frontier army. His rise was a triumph of military self-assertion. The soldiers on the Rhine had realized that they not only had to obey, but could make history themselves. But Vitellius also failed because his power was too narrowly based on a particular military group. He won against Otho, but he did not win the entire empire permanently. Other armies, other provinces, and other political networks did not feel sufficiently involved. Thus the logic that had raised him himself was repeated. If the Rhine legions could make one emperor, the Eastern and Danube forces could support another. Vespasian, finally, drew the most successful lesson from this chaos. He did not win because he was free from violence, nor because his claim was morally untouched. He won because his power base was broader. He connected the legions in the east, the support of Syria, the control of Egypt, the importance of grain supply, and finally the deployment of the Danube legions. He understood that an emperor should not have just one city, one guard, or a single army behind him. He needed an imperial structure. His victory showed that the empire could continue to exist after the end of the old dynasty, but only if a ruler controlled the real forces of the empire. The most important legacy of the Year of the Four Emperors was therefore the realization that the army had finally become visible as an emperor. Of course, the military had already played a central role before. Augustus himself owed his rise to the civil war armies of the late Republic. Later emperors also knew that they could not neglect the soldiers. But in the year 69, this truth became public and repeatable in a new way. Several armies raised different candidates. Several emperors were created or destroyed by military support. The Senate was able to recognize, but not decide. The capital could cheer or tremble, but not alone. The final power lay with those who were armed and ready to march. This experience permanently changed the relationship between the emperor and the army. No ruler after 69 could forget that soldiers were not just tools. They had expectations, memories, and their own political weight. They wanted pay, donatives, recognition, fair treatment, and the feeling that their service had meaning. Anyone who disregarded them risked more than dissatisfaction. He risked uprising, mutiny, and civil war. At the same time, an emperor had to prevent the army from becoming too powerful and independent. He had to reward without seeming dependent. He had to show closeness without letting himself be dominated by the soldiers. This tension remained a basic problem of the Roman imperial period. The provinces also gained new visibility through the Year of the Four Emperors. The empire was no longer to be understood as a political pyramid in which Rome simply commanded and everyone else obeyed. Spain could produce an emperor. Germania was able to raise an anti-emperor. The East was able to found a new dynasty. Egypt was able to exert political pressure through its grain supply. The Danube legions were able to determine the outcome of a civil war. The empire was a network of centers of power, and the emperor had to control this network. Rome remained the symbol, but the provinces were not just a backdrop. They were bearers of power. For the Senate, the year 69 was a bitter lesson. He remained venerable, important, and necessary for the administration of the empire, but his political powerlessness in an emergency was unmistakable. Senators could recognize rulers, confer titles, and make public statements, but they could not stop a determined army. Many senators survived by adapting. They greeted Galba, then Otho, then Vitellius, then Vespasian. This adaptation was not only cowardice, but an expression of their situation. The Senate continued to be an organ of the Roman order, but no longer its sovereign center. The Year of the Four Emperors made this shift openly visible. An important experience also remained for the people of Rome. The capital had experienced that imperial bills of exchange were not only political news, but had direct consequences for security, supplies, and everyday life. Hunger, fear of soldiers, rumors, violence on the streets, the burning of the capital, and the death of emperors in or near the city shaped the consciousness. People could see that an emperor counted not only by descent or title, but by his ability to provide bread, peace, and protection. A ruler who secured supplies and contained violence gained acceptance, even if his path to power had been bloody. In an exhausted society, stability itself can become the strongest form of legitimacy. The Year of the Four Emperors also had a deep symbolic dimension. The burning of the capital showed that the civil war not only destroyed people and cities, but also violated Rome's sacred self-image. The Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus was a sign of Roman greatness, religious continuity, and state dignity. The fact that it was destroyed in the internal power struggle seemed like a warning from history. If Rome could not protect its own holy places, its world domination was morally endangered. Vespasian's reconstruction therefore became an act of political healing. He didn't just put stone on stone, but tried to rebuild trust in order. In the long run, Vespasian's success became the basis of the Flavian dynasty. With him, Titus, and Domitian, the empire once again received a clear ruling family. This was decisive, because a dynasty could at least temporarily defuse the dangerous question of succession. The Flavians were not the Julio Claudier. They could not refer to the same ancient ancestry. Their legitimacy arose from victory, stabilization, military success, and public reconstruction. It was precisely in this way that they showed that the empire was changeable. It could accept a new family if it was strong enough to put things in order. The empire did not necessarily need the old bloodline. It needed a recognized center. But the problem that had become visible in 69 never completely disappeared. Later centuries were to show again and again how dangerous the relationship between the emperor and the army remained. Especially in the 3rd century, the empire was shaken by a long series of military uprisings, when soldier emperors followed one another quickly and border armies repeatedly proclaimed their own rulers. The Year of the Four Emperors was therefore not a completely exceptional case, but an early warning signal. It showed a pattern that could later recur on an even larger scale. When central legitimacy weakened and armies developed different interests, the empire became vulnerable to internal fragmentation. At the same time, however, the year 69 also proved the resilience of the Roman system. Despite murder, civil war, burning temples, changing emperors, and marching armies, the empire did not collapse. The administration continued to function, the provinces remained largely integrated, the armies could be reorganized, and a new ruler was able to establish stability. This is just as important as the crisis itself. Rome was vulnerable, but not weak. It could survive severe internal convulsions if in the end a center of power emerged that was strong enough to reunite the diverging forces. The legacy of the Year of the Four Emperors therefore lies in a double truth. On the one hand, it revealed the danger of a system that had no clear, universally accepted succession and whose supreme power depended on military loyalty. On the other hand, it showed the ability of the empire to produce a new order after a collapse of order. Out of chaos came Flavian stability. From the Battles of Bedriacum, the death of Galba, Otho's suicide, and the cruel end of Vitellius, a new political reality grew. Vespasian was not the ruler who healed all wounds immediately, but he was the man who prevented the empire from drifting further apart. In the end, the Year of the Four Emperors remains as one of the great turning points of the early imperial period. It shattered the illusion that the system created by Augustus would continue to exist on its own. It showed that every emperor had to actively fight for loyalty, provision, recognition, and military control. It made it clear that power in the Roman Empire was never just a matter of titles, but a matter of networks, resources, and armed consent. And it left a lesson that no later emperor could ignore. If you wanted to rule Rome, you had to not only own the palace, but also convince the armies, involve the provinces, feed the capital, and tell a story that enough people could believe in. Thus, the Year of the Four Emperors ended not simply with a victor, but with a new insight into the nature of Roman rule. Rome remained the mistress of the world, but she had seen how quickly her own power could be turned against herself. The legions had recognized their strength. The provinces had shown their importance. The Senate had felt its limits. The population had learned that order could not be taken for granted. And Vespasian had understood that after a year of blood, only those who regained trust out of fear could rule permanently. This was the real legacy of the Year of the Four Emperors. Rome learned that an empire is not held together by conquest alone, but by the fragile art of transforming power into order.